Ladies and gentlemen, pay attention. It's time. We've waited all week for this. And we didn't have it last week, so we've been waiting for like 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, or 100 years, to talk to someone who has his head on his shoulders, who has knowledge and information that I don't. We're here. We're gathered together today to learn, to discuss. This is Agent Smith. This is episode 33. Listen up. Let's begin.
Agent Smith.
Hello?
What's up, dude?
Oh, hey. Not much. How are you?
Business.
Business, huh?
Yeah, it's been a good week. I did a 24-hour stream on Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yeah. How did that go?
Fantastic. It's always extra hype, people seeing that feat of endurance, feeling more generous, and lots of people want to watch and whatnot, so that was really good. And then it takes another 3 to 4 days to recover. I feel like I'm finally recovered for the most part now, but it takes a while.
Gotcha. Oh, cool. Yeah, those have to take a lot out of you.
Mm-hmm.
I
So
couldn't do that.
We've been away for a little bit. What have you been up to?
Working on the podcast, reading the news,
Mm-hmm.
watching Star Wars. Been getting caught up on that a little bit. It's been a few years since I've really watched anything, so there's a bit of there was a bit of content to get through.
Which ones were you watching? Just all the movies? Like the old ones?
Rogue One, I think.
Nice.
And then Star Wars Rebels, that cartoon that Disney released a couple years ago.
Cool. I think Rogue One is my favorite, just for a really refreshingly linear and straightforward Star Wars story.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them kind of develop into a clusterfuck, and there's a bunch of stuff going on, and it's not really executed that well, sorting stuff out. But this was like, you have a clear cast, you have a clear mission, and the nature of the characters was largely defined by the actions they took, as opposed to needing to say everything about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a nice change of pace. I've always kind of wanted a Star Wars war movie, since that was more the aspect that had always interested me. So it was kind of nice to see that finally.
Yeah.
Pretty fun little movie.
So we've been out of the loop for a couple weeks. I was up for a birthday party, and then I think we missed another week for some random reason, but we're back at it. I know the Trump Mueller meme is always a thing that we want to get updated on. There's always the people on Reddit who are like, he's gonna be impeached, it's happening. But it's just more links in the chain, it seems like. Has anything new happened?
Probably. I think there was some traction, some new thing released. I don't follow it that much, because I pretty much expect it to play out exactly the same way as the Hillary Clinton email thing. And thus far, it pretty much has. You know, like you said, it's pretty much just one thing after another, but that none of it really leading to something that you would consider impeachable. So it's mostly a sideshow, I think. It may or may not be the case that there is something there. I'm not judging that, but I doubt that the investigation itself will find anything concrete. So for that reason, it doesn't really interest me all that much, and nothing I've seen in the news really caught my eye and made me think, oh, that's a big development. So it's pretty much on autopilot at this point. The thing about a big investigation like that is that it's guaranteed to find wrongdoing somewhere. You know, politics attracts a very particular type of person. And so there's almost always something going on there to find out when you launch an investigation. So the fact that there was some wrongdoing being uncovered here and there, no great shock. But if you're going to look for something major, like collusion or whatever the proper legal term for that would be, probably not. But that, you know, the people who launched the investigation probably knew that. You know, the idea that the investigation is at least partly politically motivated is probably true. You know, when you launch, I mean, that the Kin Starr investigation back in the Clinton administration was a good example of that, because there wasn't really a whole lot of wrongdoing there in the first place to raise suspicion, but there was enough for Congress to launch an investigation that they knew would dog the Clinton administration for an extended period of time. So part of the reason the Mueller investigation was launched was probably to hobble the Trump administration for maybe the first year or so of the administration, if not more. Now, again, I'm not saying that the investigation is not completely warranted. There were enough questions there to launch the investigation in the first place. But there was an ulterior motive there, I suspect. But yeah, beyond that, I don't know of any major developments there. And again, I wouldn't really expect any.
Well, I think we talked about the general process of this kind of investigation, where you start with the low-tier guys who have done some of the dirty work, and you squeeze them a bit, and you offer them a lighter sentence if they talk, and then you work your way up the chain gradually. So, like you're saying here about we're not sure where it's going to go, but we're guaranteed to find something. It seems like the question isn't, is there something going on? The question is, how much stuff is going on, and who is involved?
Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to know about the top until we squeeze all the other layers, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I imagine you could well end up tying Donald Trump himself to some kind of, probably what would be considered negligence, I suspect is the most you could probably tag him for. I mean, just a combination of ignorance of the political process on his part, plus legal advice designed to shield him from anything that he's trying to do, combined would probably preclude the investigation from really tagging him with something more than negligence. He'll probably be covered there. I don't know, Donald Trump does not strike me as somebody who is a mastermind of conspiracy making. He doesn't seem like that kind of guy. He seems like somebody who would just sort of bungle into something illegal more than going out of his way for it. So I don't think that they're going to uncover an active campaign to collude with the Russians. Probably at most they tried to get some information from them. I think if nothing else, the Russians themselves would have been clever and responsible enough not to leave any significant evidence, any indictable evidence on that count if they had made that effort. So at the very least, the Russians would have covered their trail, even if the Trump campaign lacked the competence to do so. Yeah, I don't know. It could go either way, but I just don't invest enough in it to really pay much attention. Mm-hmm. If I see something big, if I see a major headline or a major development, then I would. But I just haven't seen that yet. It seems more like a political tool at this point, used by both the left and right, more than a substantive investigation in its own right.
Yeah.
The left likes it because they want to use it use it against the administration, but also to motivate supporters. And then the right, specifically the Trump administration, uses it to kind of fire the victim complex and try to make their opponents look bad and try to use it as an excuse for shortcomings in the administration's policymaking. So it's a useful tool for all involved, and if only for that reason, it's going to drag out a lot longer, probably. Let's see. I think, have you been following the Turkey pastor thing?
No, what's that?
So there's this pastor who was arrested like a year or two ago. It was following the crackdown after the coup attempt in Turkey. And the Turkish government was, arresting all of these people that had even the mildest evidence of association with Gulen and the Gulenist movement in Turkey. And one of the guys that got swept up in those mass arrests was a Christian pastor from the United States.
Uh-oh.
And the Turkish government has been holding him for a while, and I suspect the Turkish government is partly holding him as leverage, because there is this ongoing tension between Turkey and the U.S. over not only the fact that Gulen himself lives in the United States and the U.S. government refuses to extradite him, But there's also issues over Syria, specifically U.S. support for Kurdish militias in Syria. So my suspicion is that the Erdogan government wants to kind of use this guy as a bargaining chip. I don't really know how much they really think he's a Gulenist of some kind or is associated with Gulen. But it's escalated over the past week or two as the Trump administration has piled on some economic pressure. It started with threats that I largely discounted. Trump administration is never short on threats, so I generally don't read much into the first one. But then they followed that up with sanctions on, I think it was Turkey's Justice Department, or maybe it was individuals within Turkey's Justice Department. But those were pretty minor. I kind of wrote that off as being pretty much symbolic more than anything. The Trump administration trying to appeal to his Christian base, because, you know, the Republican Party kind of turned it into a thing that this guy is being held by a government that is not an enemy government, but that a lot of Americans are growing increasingly suspicious of. Mm-hmm. So there's a desire to kind of whip up some sentiment there and turn it into a political issue, something that they can turn into political hay for the midterms, basically. And but they didn't really follow it up with much, and I didn't really see much of a genuine effort to really negotiate the release, to really engage with the Turkish government. And then this past week, there were new sanctions levied. I think it was not really sanctions per se, but de facto sanctions. They increased the steel and aluminum tariff on Turkey by an additional 10 percentage points, I think it was. Those who have been paying attention to the sundry trade wars, if you can call them that, by the Trump administration over the past year will remember the steel and aluminum tariffs that were implemented. Those were the first major set of tariffs that the Trump administration initiated as part of its new trade policy, basically. And this past week, they increased those tariffs by an additional amount, specifically for Turkey, nobody else, but just Turkey, as part of this pressure on the Turkish government. Now, these aren't really that impactful in and of themselves, because Turkey doesn't really, at least as far as I know, I don't think this is the case, I don't think Turkey sells a lot of steel and aluminum to the United States. So these are, in a sense, more symbolic sanctions. But they were disproportionately impactful because the Turkish economy has been having problems lately. And it's, well, I mean, long story short, the Turkish currency was devalued by 20% following the announcement of those higher tariffs. And that's putting a lot of economic pressure on the Turkish government. And Erdogan has been making noise about, you know, the United States not being a reliable ally, and how if they don't stop applying pressure over this issue, that Turkey will find other allies, that there are alternatives, etc., etc. So that's kind of the issue in a nutshell. There is this standoff, so to speak, a diplomatic standoff, over this pastor being held by the Turkish government.
It's kind of funny, too, since I think Trump was very buddy-buddy with Erdogan when they met. Which kind of fits with his profile of being the strongman leader archetype, and so is Erdogan, so for him to have some respect there kind of fits with the theme of him being chill with Kim Jong-un and Putin and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. The thing, though, about strongmen is that while they're shaking each other's hands, they have the other hand behind their back on a knife. You know, they don't really fundamentally trust each other. They'll be buddy-buddy for the cameras, and if they have something in common that they want to work towards, but they're never really on the same page. That's one of the things, that's one of the aspects of the Eurosceptic movement, if you want to call it that, in Europe. There's a lot of conservative parties, political parties in the European Parliament that are skeptical of the European Union and don't want it to expand and centralize further, maybe even want to draw it down a little bit. But they have a lot of trouble working together and coordinating. And it's hobbled their efforts to try to have any kind of common political front. You know, they'll agree on things like roughly the size of the European Union and immigration and things like that, but, you know, then they'll turn around and start infighting. I think one of the examples of that was the Hungarian conservative Hungarian political party in the European Parliament, if it is a party. Still claims Transylvania should be a part of Hungary. And Transylvania is a province, basically a region of Romania, that has a large Hungarian minority. And the status of Transylvania was a big issue in the 20th century between Hungary and Romania, and it's kind of been a running issue for conservatives in Romania and Hungary. And it's not really a substantive issue because Romania is almost certainly not going to give it up. And I don't think there's really a large enough population of Hungarians in Transylvania to ever really start a powerful irredentist movement there. But it's something that nationalists in Hungary feel strongly about.
We have a Transylvanian in the chat right now.
Oh, cool. Hello. Yeah, please do contribute your perspective on that. I would be interested to hear it. Certainly if I'm wrong. The usual disclaimer, I'm not an expert in everything we talk about. I have a stronger background in some things than others, so chat is certainly encouraged to contribute. If I say anything wrong, biased, etc., please correct me. I want to know if I'm wrong more than anybody. It is meant to be more participative, even if I do a lot of talking. And for those who don't know, I don't read the chat while we do this, but I will read it after. So I will see comments later on. But yeah, Hungarian nationalists care a lot about that, and they don't really want to let it go, and that causes tension between Romanian and Hungarian conservatives in the European Parliament, and makes it a little difficult to get them to work together. And that's just one example. That's just one case study. There's a lot of little issues like that, scattered around various conservative parties. I guess this isn't an example, but this is an interesting, somewhat related anecdote. There was a guy from Northern Ireland. I don't remember his name, but he was a very conservative Protestant radical from Northern Ireland. And I think at one point he was in the European Parliament and started, screaming at the Pope, who was a visiting speaker that day. And, all manner of conspiracy type stuff. But it kind of gives you an idea of the type of far-right people that can sometimes end up in the European Parliament. And those kinds of people often have share common ground in terms of certain policies on certain political issues. But a lot of the time, some of their other wingbat far-right perspectives clash with each other, and then they just end up fighting. So I'm not saying I'm not saying Donald Trump and his administration is a far-right administration, but his style of politics is very much a strongman style. And while he might superficially get along with, Mohammed bin Salman or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or whoever, those relationships are always transactional and subject to change as soon as it's in their perceived interests. Not sure how I got onto that. Meandered a little too long.
Well, I think we started with Trump and Erdogan getting along, being strong politicians.
That's what it. Yeah, you're right.
Which, to break it down a little bit, like you said, strongman is more of a style than an alignment. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say whether you're left or right or authoritarian. Well, I guess usually it's more authoritarian.
Yeah, it leans more authoritarian. But I think that's a good way of putting it. Thank you. As usual, you're better at kind of putting these things together than I am. Yeah, that it's more of a style than a alignment. And, Trump and Erdogan nominally got along at first, but there are sort of fundamental policy differences there, fundamental differences in interests, etc. And those have been manifesting in the Turco-American relationship over the past few years. That said, I don't really read too much into the threats by Erdogan that Turkey would really consider an alternative alliance. Yeah, there are definitely issues in the relationship, and really there always kind of have been, even before Erdogan came to power. But I think Turkey breaking its alliance with the United States, formally or even informally, would create a lot more problems for Turkey than it would solve. Fundamentally, Turkey benefits from its economic relationship to the West, Europe more so, but also to the United States, and also benefits from the security arrangement it has with NATO and the sundry economic and political corollary agreements that kind of come with that. So severing those relationships in favor of a set of relationships with probably Russia. I mean, that's kind of the implied threat, that they'll align more with Russia. That doesn't really have a lot of credibility to me. You know, that's my opinion anyway. You know, make of that what you will. But Russia cannot offer as much economically or politically or technologically, so to speak, than the West can for Turkey. And Turkey itself is not really powerful enough to significantly project force in its region, such that it could be a counter force to European power and influence or to American power and influence in its region. You know, I mean, just as an example of that, Turkey has struggled to project influence into Syria. If they really wanted to, they could probably just steamroll the Syrian military and conquer half the country, but you know, for a host of reasons, that's not really quite viable. And so they've kind of been bottled up in Idlib province for much of their effort to expand their sphere of influence into Syria since the war started. So I think Turkey would like to have a more independent foreign policy. I suspect that's more the direction that they're going, and we've kind of talked about that before at some length. I think Erdogan mostly just wants to be more independent than he does want to sever the relationship completely. And so this is probably just more evolution in that vein. This is just more Turkey asserting itself relative to its traditional partners and kind of trying to stake out a claim to its region that it sees as more in its sphere of influence than it does in anybody else's. You know, the Turkish government, and specifically Erdogan, has kind of given the impression, at least, that the Middle East is sort of Turkey's zone, and that should be considered their area of influence. And Turkey has gone out of its way over the past 10 to 15 years to cultivate diplomatic and economic ties to various actors, both state and non-state, in the region, in an effort to try to extend its influence there. So I don't think it's a stretch to say the Turkish government has that as an ambition. But again, there's the issue of capacity. They just don't quite have the capacity to really flesh that vision out completely. You know, they do need at least one major partner to kind of make that work, either, you know, Europe, the US, or Russia. Russia could help them extend influence, but the issue then would be the countervailing force that would be brought. You know, if Turkey is not an ally, then it's a rival. And if the United States and Europe start treating Turkey as a rival, that's going to severely inhibit, if not completely negate, any new advantage it would have in the Middle East that would be proffered by an alliance with Russia. In fact, it would probably reduce Turkish influence in the Middle East, just because there's such a disparity in power there. So that's just a snapshot of why I think that Turkey probably won't, either because of the Pasteur disagreement or because of overarching tensions in the relationship with the U.S., why I think they won't, because of those reasons, switch to Russia or otherwise sever their relationship with the West. That doesn't mean they won't troll. They might do things here and there to upset the alliance, to upset economic relations, etc. But that'll be mostly for show, I think. Kind of like the minor war scare with Greece before the election a few months ago. There was some talk about, you know, escalating tension between Greece and Turkey, and there was never really any substance to that. It was mostly just for show, for domestic political reasons in Turkey, you know, just trying to look strong before a major election. So there will probably be more of that. I'm sure people who are critical of Erdogan will no doubt be given many more reasons over the next few years to be critical. But I don't think it'll represent a substantive change in Turkey's diplomatic alignment. And it may not matter in the long run, because there's also another issue in Turkey with Turkey's economy, which has been struggling a bit lately, which is a bit weird, because Turkey's economy had been doing pretty well over the past 15-20 years. It's because of Turkey's economy doing well that Erdogan has as much support as he does. There's also sort of the populist, pseudo-Islamist, pro-business side of his politics that appeals to a lot of people, and the fact that he's just against the establishment, such as it was at the time when he first came to power. But another aspect just has been that superior economic performance under his government. You know, a good people will forgive a lot if you can deliver a good economy, you know, even if you're not entirely responsible for it. People kind of give credit to the party in power. Mm-hmm. But over the past, you know, I think year or two, they've been running into problems, and kind of has to do with inflation in part. You know, I'm still kind of trying to draw a full picture of what's happening in the Turkish economy. My impression had been that they were doing pretty good, but apparently I was wrong. Inflation is at the highest level now than it's been since 2004. That's what I read anyway. And part of the reason there's inflation now in Turkey is, for one, expansionary fiscal and tax policy. You know, low taxes, lots of government spending. In general, stuff that stimulates the economy, but there's been too much of it for too long, such that it's basically overheating the economy. It's straining the economy's capacity to meet the demand that's being incurred. And when you have too much demand and not enough supply, you know, prices go up. It's just basic economics. There's also the issue of low interest rates, and it's not really clear how independent the central bank in Turkey is now. It had been pretty independent, but there's been a lot of de facto pressure brought by the Erdogan administration to try to keep interest rates low. That's good for business in general. It makes it easier to get leverage for deals and whatnot. But to have low interest rates and an expansionary monetary policy at a time when the economy is overheating, that's just going to make it overheat even more, and that's going to cause inflation and currency devaluation, which is what's been happening. Interest rates would have to go up to negate that. I mean, in general, economic orthodoxy is that when the economy overheats and there's inflation, you should raise interest rates to try to take some heat out of the economy, kind of get it to slow down a little bit so that prices can cool off and so you don't end up, in order to prevent deflationary cycles. But it seems like the Erdogan government is pressuring the central bank not to do that, and that's kind of making things worse. And it's also creating a problem of political risk, which is that it would be one thing if the central bank were just unusually lax in its monetary policy when the economy is overheating, but the sense that it might actually have lost its independence and be subject to political forces introduces political risk into the country. And the reason that's important is that if you're a foreign investor, you factor political risk into your calculations. You know, that's a part of your calculus for how much to invest in a country. The more political risk there is in a country, the less you want to invest in it. And if political risk in a country rises, you're probably going to withdraw some of your money you have invested there in order to mitigate your risk, in order to try to prevent any potential losses occurring down the line. That's, you know, political risk is just normal calculus. You know, it's calculated along with everything else, like potential returns, the safety of the investment environment, etc. It's basically just another economic variable. And as this particular economic variable becomes less favorable, there's going to be less investment, and that's exacerbating the economic problem. And you can kind of see that with some of the investment money being pulled out of Turkey. Investors are basically getting skittish. So all of that kind of comes together to make Turkey's economy a little overheated, you know, too much inflation, not enough investment, etc. And it's causing problems with employment, and over the long run it's going to start, well, short to medium run, it's going to start causing problems with consumption and employment. Further problems with employment, rather. I also should mention that it's expected that interest rates in the United States are going to go up. They've kind of already done that a little bit. I mean, there's been a few rises over the past year or two. The reason that's important is that if interest rates in a country go up, investors will redistribute more money into that market to take advantage of the higher rates. Higher interest rates means that you can lend money at a higher rate of return. And so you want to lend more money in those markets, basically, where there's a higher interest rate. So if interest rates in the US go up, then probably a fair amount of money will be pulled out of developing markets like Turkey and invested back into the United States to take advantage of those higher rates. And so because it's expected that the United States is going to do that, people are kind of, before the fact, redistributing that money to try to take advantage of it. You know, expectations are as important as reality when it comes to business and economics. If people expect a major downturn or upturn, that will significantly influence investor behavior just as much as an actual downturn or upturn. I might also add here that the money coming out of Turkey further exacerbates the currency devaluation, which itself causes inflation, because Turkey is not really big enough an economy produce everything it needs to consume. So there are a fair amount of imports into Turkey. And so when the currency devalues, that has a disproportionate effect on inflation, because a lot of those goods and services that Turkey imports are suddenly more expensive. So those are all big problems. They would probably be pretty easy to deal with if interest rates would rise and if the government would relax the expansionary fiscal and tax policies. Those are not big asks. Those are pretty simple policy solutions. You know, it's almost weird to see Turkey's economy suffering from overheating. You really don't see it a whole lot. Mostly you've seen deflation over the past 10, 15 years. There's not a whole lot of examples of economies suffering from expansionary inflation. Most of the inflation you've seen over the past 15, 20 years has come more from commodity prices being very high. That's kind of a whole other conversation, why that's the case. You know, there's kind of a debate in economics about missing inflation in individual countries, if not the global economy as a whole. So Turkey apparently does not have that problem. It's pretty explicitly there for everybody to see. But the reason I bring up the Turkish economy, to kind of bring that full circle, the Turkish government may not have the resources fiscally that it needs to kind of have a major active foreign policy in the Middle East, if not also Europe, if the Turkish economy kind of suffers, if not tanks. That being the case, that would significantly inhibit the Turkish government's ambitions, and that would probably serve to cool relations with Turkey's partners in the European Union, the United States, and probably maybe also Russia. Without, you know, needing better economic ties in order to mitigate an economic downturn would probably significantly ease up on those tensions. So that's something to keep an eye on. If the Erdogan government does not take policy action to deal with the inflation, there will probably be, I would guess, a corresponding easing of political tensions between the US and Turkey, if not also Turkey and Europe. On the other hand, if the Turkish government does take the necessary actions, there would probably still be that same hostility there. It could go either way. I think part of the reason the Erdogan government is a little hesitant to engage in those policy levers, those policy solutions to inflation, is that they would probably come with a political cost. You know, one of the corollaries to raising interest rates is that the economy slows down and that there's more unemployment, lower wage growth, etc. And people would probably blame the Erdogan government for that. So there may be a fear on the part of the AKP, Erdogan's party, that they might take a major hit at a time when the government is still... The government support is a little shaky. It's still relatively strong, but it's relatively shaky compared to what it's been over the past 10, 15 years. Because of, well, partly because of the economy, but just also general discontent with the direction Turkey has been taking under the AKP. There's always been a large minority in Turkey that just despises the AKP and Erdogan. Those are generally the people in the urban areas in the west of the country. They're a little more modern, a little more prosperous, and they generally don't identify as much with the socially conservative policies of the AKP. But as the country has gotten wealthier, more and more people are kind of growing up as wealthy urban elite, basically. And those people have less and less in common with AKP voters and the AKP policy agenda. So ironically, well, maybe not ironically, but perhaps predictably, as the Turkish economy modernizes, partly because of the AKP, more and more people in turn, over time, turn on the AKP as they identify less and less with the socially conservative side of its agenda. You can kind of see that same phenomena in a lot of places. You know, as there's more economic development, there's generally more urbanization, and generally urbanization produces more kind of leftist politics. You know, a lot of what you would consider kind of leftist politics in the United States, at least socially speaking. You know, for example, in Texas, Texas is a very conservative state in the United States. But as the economy has grown in Texas over the past half century, the urban areas of Texas have become more and more leftist, especially socially. Probably still relatively conservative compared to Europe and certain other parts of the United States, but it's definitely leaning more and more to the left over time in the urban areas.
Well, yeah, you would say that that's been the primary driver for Texas kind of becoming more purple as opposed to being clearly a red state.
Yeah.
Which, if you want to go one step further, what could you say that the biggest driving force for making Texas lean more left is air conditioning?
In a sense, yeah. In a sense, in so much as air conditioning facilitated mass migration to Texas after World War II, then yeah, you could kind of pin the blame on air conditioning, so to speak. Yeah, that's, air conditioning helped not only Texas, but most of the South. Because before air conditioning, it was generally considered a little too hot and inhospitable to really be a place you wanted to move to. But with air conditioning and improvements in medicine, the southern part of the United States and Texas became much more attractive, and there was a lot more in-country migration from the north and midwest of the United States into the south. It also helped that there was a more pro-business environment. That had kind of always been true, though. The technological advancement in medicine and also air conditioning and other amenities kind of made it more possible. It also helped that people had saved up a lot of money in World War II, so they kind of had the resources to build up new suburbs and whatnot in the South, where there kind of hadn't been any before. But yeah, air conditioning was definitely a part of that, and probably remains a part of that. I can't imagine living here without air conditioning.
Yep.
You learned that the hard way recently.
Yep.
It wasn't a lot of fun.
Nope.
Can't imagine.
Bless
Yeah,
air
Southern
conditioning.
California is a little different because the climate is actually a little more mild there. Even though it's kind of on the same latitude, it's by the ocean, and that kind of eases the heat a bit. We don't really have that advantage here in Texas. I guess maybe around Houston and the coast, but I don't live there. I live inland. It's much hotter here. Anyway, that same phenomena is playing out in Turkey. So as Turkey's economy kind of improves, there's more and more urbanites who are kind of want something different as far as government policy. We'll see how that plays out. I don't think the AKP is going to tank the Turkish economy to try to prevent people from, urbanizing and turning on them. That would be self-defeating. I think jobs and income are the big driver for AKP support in Turkey. So they would be shooting themselves in the foot if they did that. But the party will probably have to evolve over time. It's just going to have to change in order to reflect the demographic and social changes in Turkey that are occurring because of the economic growth that it's delivered. If it doesn't, they're going to be on the outs, and either a new party will take power or there will be a significant increase in partisanship in Turkey as the AKP tries desperately through hook or crook to hang on to its gains. That's all long-term stuff, though. That could go either way. It's very hard to predict over the long term.
Someone in the chat was asking if you were defending Erdogan. I don't know how many new viewers we have in this session, but Agent Smith tends to be a very neutral kind of figure, but we do talk about a lot of people who get hyped up a lot, either for being really good or really evil, depending on your perspective. So it's more about articulating the stage and the actors in the drama that's developing in the world, as opposed to being the judge who's deciding who's in the right and who's in the wrong. I think if you see the stage for what it is, you as a thinker on your own 2 feet can kind of deal out judgment if you feel it's necessary or whatever. But no, we're not pro Erdogan or defending him against anything. Heck, he's so far away that what he does isn't really that relevant to us. If you want me to give my personal perspective, his cracking down on freedom of the press and stuff is pretty upsetting. Like journalists disappearing, being killed, stuff like that. That's a...
Well, to be fair to Erdogan, he hasn't really killed a lot of journalists. Or I don't think he's really killed any. It's not like Russia where, you can kind of get away with that. Erdogan's thing is more mass arrests.
No,
that doesn't mean
he doesn't kill the journalists, he just throws them in jail.
Yeah, Turkey actually has more journalists in jail right now than any other country, as I recall. If I'm wrong on that, someone please correct me in chat, but I think I remember reading that Turkey has the most journalists in jail right now. That's more his thing. I'm sure he would like to kill some. He seems like the type who would be vengeful in that way, who would have a vendetta. But I don't think he's really killed any. I'm sure somebody in chat might have a counterexample, but if he has, it hasn't been in the same way that journalists have been killed in places like Russia, where there's more of a pattern of that. That's kind of a conversation in itself, since I doubt the Russian state itself is behind that. But we can kind of get into that if somebody wants to. But yeah, definitely journalists are feeling the pinch in Turkey. Yeah, and to get back to what we were talking about before, yeah, I try to be descriptive more than anything when we talk about these things. I'm just trying to kind of give people an understanding, or at least share my understanding of the issue. I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not really interested in, pushing one perspective or the other. I'm just trying to understand and to help others understand, if possible. So I don't defend Erdogan. I don't defend Joseph Stalin. That's still my favorite example from a couple months ago. Yeah. We were talking about Joseph Stalin, and I think what was the question? I don't really remember what the original question was. But basically, it was something like, how was Joseph Stalin an effective leader? And whatever you think of Joseph Stalin, there's a lot of people in Russia who like him because they think he's a strong leader. But no sooner had I said there are people in Russia who think he's a strong leader than somebody confused that for me saying that I'm a Stalinist. So that guy accused me of being communist. I've been accused of many things on here.
Yep.
It's one of the fun things in chat to kind of see what new thing I'll be accused of this week.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Also, kind of getting in the shoes of someone who doesn't share your perspective, like whether or not you are pro or anti-Stalin, that doesn't change the fact that there are people who exist who are pro-Stalin, and they're a part of the world. So if you're trying to understand the world, then that's an area that you could potentially run into. And another point is, we don't all get the full information in its truest form about what's going on. We deal with a lot of partial truths and partial information, and we're trying to make sense of our lives in the bigger picture, given that sort of scenario where it's not perfectly clear. We're not all given the same story. Sometimes you hear all the good bits and not the bad bits. Sometimes you hear all the bad bits and not the good bits. It's that kind of thing. It's always a mixed bag. I think there's that desire for people to just get to a thing and then be told, this is how it is. This is how you think about it now. And then you move on to the next thing. That's a very relaxed listening experience, as opposed to the active listening, where you're taking in information and then also kind of chipping away at it with your own intuition and your own knowledge of the situation, and potentially disagreeing with stuff, which is important for maintaining your own internal integrity.
Yeah, there are many different perspectives when it comes to consider when studying a given economic, political, etc. issue. And understanding them all requires study of, all manner of different groups. And many of them have radically different perspectives, radically different experiences than, your own. And that requires a certain relaxing of judgment in order to really put yourself in their shoes.
Well, you could say suspension, too, because I don't think...
Yeah, that's a good word.
I don't think some people will be relaxed, even if you tell them to. No, the world is on fire! You can't calm me down.
Yeah, fair point. But yeah, that is an important consideration. You kind of do have to do that in order to really get into the minds of other people, to really understand them fully. It's not just about judging. You don't have to be considered with... You don't always have to obsess over what should be when you're reading the news or learning about the world or studying something or etc.
But you can.
But, well, yeah, you definitely can. Some people definitely get a kick out of that. But, just general word of advice, don't be as concerned with what should be. Be more concerned with what will be. That's kind of more of an analyst's perspective. Whether you like something you read about or not, read about it and just try to understand it. Understand the dynamics behind it. Understand the drivers, the actors, the events, the history, etc. And just try to get that full spectrum comprehension as much as you can. Obviously, perfection is not really possible. You know, I'm myself definitely far from perfect in many ways. But that should be what you kind of strive for. You know, don't read the news to get outraged. You know, there is kind of a temptation of that, and you know, I remember doing that back when I was in college. You know, I read the news and it was just more about, oh, you know, this is upsetting. I don't like this. I'm going to comment angrily, share how upset and then after a while, I just kind of got tired of it because, you know, what's the point? All right, I'm angry now, but I'm not really any further along in understanding why this thing is happening or what I can do to change it or etc. So
what if I like being upset by the news?
A lot of people do. And that's a very viable business model to cater to those people. It's one of the reasons the media has gone so crazy over the past 10 years, you know. Not a lot of people reliably watch the news, so they can't really make money off those people, but you can always make money off crazy. That's a very reliable demographic. So the news has kind of changed accordingly.
And by crazy here, we don't mean someone who has a mental illness. I think you're talking about people who are kind of frantically looking for something to fuss about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
something to be afraid
diplomatic.
of. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and to be fair, some of that is down to inexperience. You know, I mean, if you're kind of newer to the world of politics and institutions and etc., you kind of want heuristics. You want shortcuts. You know, you want to understand, but it can be hard to do without really digging into the details. And there are always people who offer those kinds of shortcuts. I think you had one of them in chat earlier today when I was watching.
Was that the Alex Jones guy?
Yeah, there's always people like that on the right or left who think they kind of have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's heuristics more than anything. You know, it doesn't mean they're wrong, it just means that if they're right, they're not right for the right reasons.
They got lucky.
Yeah, that's kind of like people who predicted the Soviet Union would collapse someday. I remember saying that on chat way back when we first started. I asserted that nobody saw the collapse of the Soviet Union coming in 1991. Everybody was very shocked by that, and I would stand by that comment. But there was one person who was incredulous, and I admit that there definitely were people who had predicted the Soviet Union would collapse. There were people in 1917 who predicted it, and in 1918 and 1919. There was people every year from the Soviet Union's inception who predicted, oh, this can't last, it's going to collapse. And so no surprise that those people were right eventually. There was no real substantive analysis behind a lot of that assertion. A lot of it was ideological predisposition. You know, the real reasons for the Soviet Union's collapse are a whole conversation in and of itself. We could talk about it if somebody wants to, but just saying, oh, they're going to collapse because their economy's badly managed, well, okay. Eventually you'll be right someday, but it won't be exclusively for that reason. You know, there's an old saying we have in the United States, if not the English-speaking world in general, it's even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that similar kind of phenomena.
Yeah, well, you can look at people who make their living predicting stuff, like Ray Kurzweil is probably the first name that comes to mind, where his whole shtick is saying, at this time period, this is going to happen, on this year, we're going to have this breakthrough. And if he makes hundreds and hundreds of predictions, he's bound to be right for a couple of them. And then that serves as evidence that he's a good predictor. Without actually representing that he's right more often than he's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the con. That's a really great trick to pull. Just make lots of predictions, and if you get a few right, then you're a genius.
Mm-hmm.
Happens a lot in punditry, I guess is what you would call it. TV pundits do that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of accountability among TV pundits. Kind of note that. Well, this might be a good time to talk about, since this kind of ties into that conversation, and I don't know how familiar you are with this, Neuro, inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important distinction in the sciences, and it's something that you're kind of taught early on, you know, in grad school, if you do kind of get into that. And I'm going to try to define them. I don't know how successful I'll be, because the difference is very fine. It's a very narrow difference, and it can be hard to nail down. And it's been a while since I've studied it. So I'll try my best here, but I think it's important, because I think this is important to understanding a lot of the rhetorical kind of trickery and confusion that occurs in the broader media environment. So deductive reasoning is, to kind of simplify, it's what Sherlock Holmes does, if you've ever seen anything with Sherlock Holmes in it. Deductive reasoning is taking something you already know and applying it to something you observe. So you observe something like, say, a crime scene, and then based off of what you see, you apply something you already know to draw a conclusion. So you've deduced from observation what's happening. You've deduced a conclusion. Now, all of that depends on your original knowledge base being true. If you're using deductive reasoning, you're assuming something to be true and using that to derive a conclusion. You're applying pre-existing knowledge. And so your conclusion is only going to be as good as your pre-existing knowledge. Now, deductive reasoning is really great if you're in like a profession or an investigator, like Sherlock Holmes, for example, because that's pretty much all you do is apply knowledge. You're constantly applying stuff you already know. But in science, you're in the business of creating knowledge. You're trying to discover something new, to test theory, to ask questions. And in that case, you don't really have a lot of pre-existing knowledge to work with. You might have some, but if you're going to use it, you really have to have a good reason to justify using it, because assumptions are always very dangerous in any kind of scientific inquiry. So for science, what you really want is inductive reasoning, which is different. This is where the tricky bit comes in. With inductive reasoning, you want to observe first, and then come up with a potential explanation, and then test that. So basically, you're starting with a theory, with a question, and then you're using observation to answer it. And that might be a confused answer. I apologize if so, but roughly that's what it is.
I had
you're
a
not
visual
starting...
aid pulled up too while you're discussing this too.
Just like awesome. Thank you.
A little graphic.
But the key difference there is you're not starting with an assumption. You're not starting with pre-existing knowledge. You're starting with that question, and you don't know whether or not it's true. And so then you go and test whether it's true. It's a question that could be wrong. So that's fundamentally different than deductive reasoning, where you already have that pre-existing knowledge set. So this is an important distinction to make, because a lot of what passes for political commentary is predicated on deductive reasoning. People start with an assumption that, for example, the government is turning the frogs gay. If you assume that's true from the start, then you're going to deductively apply that to everything you observe, and you're going to end up with a lot of wackadoodle conclusions. Now, if the government actually is turning the frogs gay, those conclusions have validity. But if it's not, they don't. The point is, you're never challenging that original assumption. And that's why inductive reasoning is important. Because if you use inductive reasoning when you're exploring the world and learning about the world and studying, then you question everything, and everything gets properly questioned and tested. And inductive reasoning is very challenging because most of the time the answer you get when you test questions like that is inconclusive. There's a lot of things for which there's not enough evidence to warrant a strong conclusion. And this is one of the big things that I think might surprise a lot of people about scientific inquiry. Scientific inquiry is frequently inconclusive, doesn't go anywhere. A lot of it is just painstaking effort made for nothing. That doesn't mean it's not important. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Getting a negative result is important because it kind of closes off that avenue of inquiry. But it's not very sexy. You really don't want to spend a number of years researching something only to find out, oh, nothing. There's nothing here.
We have the same process in StarCraft, to click it into what we usually broadcast. Because in StarCraft we have scouting, which is looking for information. Sometimes you scout and you don't see anything in a certain area, which is its own kind of information. You didn't find out what the opponent has, but you did find out that the opponent doesn't have anything there. Which, well, it's a negative and a positive. Right. No, I did not see anything. Yes, I still learned.
Yeah, it is important in that vein. Because you are, even if you're not getting a sexy result, the knowledge is still useful for the overarching science. You have contributed to the science by doing that. So in terms of inquiry and in terms of politics specifically, I think a lot of people enter politics with a lot of pre-existing notions, predetermined notions, and those become the basis for deductive reasoning that they apply to other issues, rather than studying issues as standalone issues, rather than looking at issues with new eyes and questioning all of the assertions that are made about them and doing, testing them with data or information or what have you, and bringing a generally skeptical mind. Skepticism is the other cornerstone of scientific inquiry. And to be fair, I don't expect everybody to kind of take that attitude with every single individual issue. We've talked before about how it's not really, well, I've talked before about how I don't think, personally, that it's really reasonable to expect everybody to have absolute knowledge about every issue. People are going to take shortcuts. People are going to use heuristic methods just to try to kind of encompass the breadth of political issues. That's kind of what ideologies are for. They kind of act as a simplifying prism through which to understand the world, specifically so that you don't have to go out and study each and every individual issue and test them all out and look at all the background information, etc. I think the bigger problem is not too much deductive reasoning in politics. That's probably just inevitable. I think the bigger problem is the lack of trust. There's been a general decline in trust in institutions in the United States, if not the West generally, if not the world generally. And if you start with the assumption that you cannot trust institutions like the government or certain other public institutions, people will use deductive reasoning to apply that to political issues. And that's more the issue. The deductive reasoning predicated on mistrust in government is more where the problem is. And in the West case, it's not just mistrust in the government, it's mistrust in corporations, nonprofits, just any kind of large institution basically has, at least in part, been discredited over the past 50 to 60 years in the West, certainly in the United States. And that's causing all manner of problems. Now, this is not the only source of trouble. This isn't the only reason that there's a lot of partisanship and political dysfunction in the United States. Obviously, there's any number of other factors that many of which we've talked about at length before: structural economic change, the information revolution, the ease of communication, technology, all of these kind of factor in there. But just as individuals, my advice would be to try to use relatively more inductive reasoning than deductive reasoning when you can. And it's not always easy to recognize because, again, it's pretty easy to use deductive reasoning without thinking about it because there are so many little assumptions we make in day-to-day life that we don't even think about. That's just sort of implicit biases, if you will, put it like that. And they're just so deeply ingrained, so deeply assumed that, you just don't think about them when you make them. So I'm not saying always use inductive reasoning. That would be a very poor tool. It would be a very hard way to live. But just try to be more skeptical, basically. That would be my general advice, and that would help mitigate, it would not cure, but it would help mitigate some of the tensions, not only political tensions in countries in general, but just in your day-to-day life. If you're more skeptical, you're less likely to be constantly outraged and more likely to be inquisitive. Events that might otherwise outrage you become more objects of interest because you're interested in studying them and learning about them. They're data points. There's something new to understand. They're a challenge to your curiosity rather than a challenge to your morality. And in that sense, it makes life a little bit easier from day to day, at least in terms of reading the news and studying the world, etc. So that kind of just ties into that previous conversation about people providing easy solutions to difficult problems and simplifying and etc. I hope the connection is clear. I'm not sure I entirely touched on that. If not,
you've been 100% today. I haven't heard any issues.
Thank you. Yeah, sometimes, not always 100%. So if I'm ever not, please do mention it. Let's see. So, was there anything in particular you wanted to get to, Neuro?
Well, I think we had some leftover questions that were never addressed in a previous session, and in addition to that, I've put a few in the chat. We don't have a dedicated questions person, but I have grabbed a few when I've had the attention.
That is you. I've noticed.
Yeah.
Okay. So did you want to do the old questions first or the new ones?
We can do the new ones first since these people are demonstrated as being here. The old
Gotcha.
questions, I think, are worth covering, but we're not 100% sure that those people are going to be around or will catch the VOD.
Gotcha. I'm not even entirely sure I can find them again. Because I remember we did some new ones again, so I think the old ones got buried a little bit. I'll try to dig around for them if we get to them. Let's see. So the first question was, there's been a lot of talk about Space Force. Yes, there has. There's been a lot of talk about Space Force lately. Would establishing a sixth branch of the armed forces expend the already huge budget used, or would it be taken from the other branches? Has there to be congressional approval for expanding the budget? And if so, what other spending will likely be cut for it? And could the Space Force be easily discontinued by a later administration? From what I've read about it, and I haven't read a whole lot, because I think it's more publicity stunt than it is substantive policy
Space Force.
Yeah. Did you, just as an aside, just as evidence of why I'm skeptical about the veracity of this as an actual policy proposal, did you, Neuro, did you see the thing where on the administration's website they were having a contest for what the new Space Force's logo would be?
No, I didn't see it. What is the...
There was like 6 options, I think, that people could vote for. It was like some reality TV thing. You could vote for what the logo would be, and you were encouraged to give a donation to, you know, the Trump campaign or make a political donation, basically. And I didn't really get the impression it was terribly serious, especially given that some of the logos were more than a bit goofy. I would encourage you to check them out. You'll get a cheap laugh out of it, I'm sure. But it kind of gave me the impression that it was more stunt than anything. It makes me a bit incredulous. But anyway, from what I have read about it, the impression I get is not that it would be like a whole new branch of government, or rather of the Department of Defense. Rather, it would be a combination, basically, of different services that already exist. So basically, they would take, you know, probably the satellite division. I don't even know what it's called, but basically, there's a division of the Air Force that's responsible for handling satellites and managing space. Air Force largely is the Space Force. The Air Force is already pretty much responsible for all of that. So basically, they would take the bits from the Air Force that do that and merge them with some of the minor branches of the other services that deal peripherally with space, and just combine them all together into one big new Space Force branch, a new service in its own right. So I don't really think it would be a significant expansion per se. Rather, they would just be reorganizing. In fact, it would be more accurate to call it a bureaucratic reorganization than it would be creating a new branch. So I don't think it would require a whole new budget, although it would require more money, because bureaucracies invariably grow. That's just kind of what they do. That's what happened with the Department of Homeland Security, which I'm still skeptical is really needed. But the idea behind the Department of Homeland Security was to create an overarching bureaucracy to manage ties and relations between the different security and intelligence agencies in the executive branch. Because there was a lot of angst after 9/11 about information that could have been passed between agencies but wasn't, and that maybe could have helped prevent 9/11. And so it was thought at the time that there was a need to have a security czar, so to speak, that could oversee all the different agencies. And so the Department of Homeland Security was created, and at first that overarching layer of bureaucracy that oversaw all the other agencies was pretty small. But it grew with time, and it just got bigger and bigger, and has basically just continued to get bigger. And it's not entirely clear how much of that is really needed. I would certainly welcome the input of somebody more familiar with DHS and what they do, because I haven't studied it myself in all that much depth. But my impression is not entirely positive of the DHS as a bureaucracy and institution. So there is a problem there. Space Force, right?
Space Force.
So Space Force could end up with a similar bureaucracy where they start very small, but it ends up growing over time such that there is a net gain in budget, in basically government spending. Does there have to be congressional approval for expanding the budget? Yes, I think there would. I mean, invariably, Congress is responsible for pretty much any and all expenditures. In so much, you might have seen in the news that the executive branch of the United States sometimes spends money on something or starts a new program or something to that effect, such that it gives the impression that the executive branch kind of has some power over spending. It actually doesn't. Generally, what the executive branch is doing in those cases is moving money around from other programs. Generally, Congress will give the executive branch some discretionary power in how it uses certain types of funding. It'll assign funding to certain areas, not specific things, not specific tasks, but just general areas that the executive branch can use that money for in relation, so long as it's in relation to that area. So generally, if the executive branch does something new like that and spends money in a new way, they're actually taking money from one of those discretionary accounts, rather than just kind of creating money out of thin air or just borrowing it. Any substantive increase in budget or budget activity of any kind generally has to be approved by Congress. You know, the executive branch can kind of lie through their teeth and, you know, misrepresent or distort how they're spending money such that they can justify using some discretionary accounts for something that they weren't originally intended for. Trump administration has made a science out of that thus far. We can talk more about that too. That's specifically agriculture was the recent example. But fundamentally, it has to be Congress. There's only so much the unadministration can do to distort that. You know, fundamentally, Congress is sort of the last word on that. What other spending will likely to be cut for it? Probably just something from the, what would you call it? I guess the word is escaping me. I don't think it's discretionary. There's a part of the budget that has to be accounted for. You know, Social Security, kind of the military, but Social Security, Medicare, etc. A lot of these entitlement programs in the United States government's budget are not discretionary. They've already been programmed, they've already been kind of written into law, and they have to budget for them. But then there's other things that I think are called discretionary spending. And those are programs that the government is not required, more or less by law, to fund every year. And generally, when there's a redistribution of resources, it almost invariably comes out of the discretionary spending part of the budget. I think the military technically counts as discretionary spending, but because it's kind of a sacred cow in U.S. politics, it's very rarely cut. The military very rarely has its budget cut unless there's some overarching issue or, you know, something big going on, like the end of the Cold War or something. So effectively, the discretionary budget is a lot of, you know, Department of Energy, Department of Education, you know, stuff like that, as well as a whole host of miscellaneous programs. It's a little hard to squeeze, though, because it's only, I think, maybe 20% of the budget. Some of the fiscal hawks listening can correct me on that. I'm sure somebody knows the number off the top of their head, but I think discretionary spending outside of the military makes up a pretty small, relatively small fraction of the budget. And so a lot of administrations kind of come into office, usually conservative, kind of come in wanting to squeeze that discretionary spending in order to try to free up money for other programs or to just cut the budget in general, but find it very difficult because it's like squeezing blood from a stone. There's just nothing there, really. So let's see. Could the Space Force be easily discontinued by a later administration? No. If Congress does act to create a Space Force, then it's done. Any future administrations could, I don't know, they could mistreat it, they could refuse to appoint people to positions, they could not spend money assigned for certain activities, but they can't undo the Space Force. Congress has to create it, and if anybody wanted to get rid of it, it would have to be Congress getting rid of it. The executive branch by itself could not discontinue it. You know, even doing something like not spending money for an assigned thing, technically that's not legal. It is technically not legal for a president to refuse to spend money that was assigned for a given purpose. Richard Nixon tried to do that in the 70s, and I think he refused to do. I don't remember what the original case was, but I remember the Nixon administration ended up in a case that went to the Supreme Court for trying to do something like that, and the Supreme Court shot them down. So the executive branch does not have total discretionary power in how it spends money. Like if Congress does spend money on something that the executive branch does not like, the executive branch does not have full discretionary power to just not spend that money and try to weasel out of not doing that thing, whatever it may be. So whatever kind of administration is in power does have to defer to Congress in terms of spending priorities. You can dabble a little bit in how the money is spent. That's what the Obama administration did with the immigration. You know, they tried to what they did is they prioritized certain immigration cases over others. And because there was a lack of capacity in the immigration processing in the Department of, ICE, I guess, Immigration Customs Enforcement. Because there was a lack of capacity, prioritizing some cases over others basically meant that those other cases almost never really came to trial. So they were still enforcing the law, they were still spending that money as mandated by Congress, but they were doing it in a particular way that fitted their political preferences. And the Trump administration has been trying to do that, not terribly successfully. You know, I mean, the whole Muslim ban thing being a case in point. It would have been very easy to do that if he had not used Twitter. The only reason that got hung up in the courts is because he went on Twitter and said, okay, the ban is in place. And then everybody said, that's not legal. So it ended up getting dragged through the court system. If he had just kept quiet about it, it would have been fine. There's a lot of examples of mismanagement like that in the Trump administration as far as little policies like that. It would do themselves a big service if they would just be quiet. You know, it's very easy to mislead the public and force through some kind of policy that you think would be unpopular but that you would want. Plenty of administrations have done that. Most of them have done so without getting tracked into the court system from day one. So that's my impression of the Space Force. I think I kind of covered all the angles here on the questions here. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it. If I missed one, you know, kind of chime in and chat and I'll get back to it, but I think I got all of them. Let's see, I read in Foreign Policy magazine that the tariffs that the administration has put on China is viewed by China as an existential threat due to its limiting of China's growth of its middle class. It's not quite a question, but I don't know that that's entirely accurate. Foreign Policy mag is in general a pretty decent place to read about foreign policy, but I don't personally always agree with everything they write. You know, that's true of any publication. But you know, in this case, as far as the tariff, I don't think the Communist Party of China really sees it as an existential threat. I think they see it more as an inconvenience. Because for them, most of their economic growth is now domestic. It doesn't come from exports and imports. Given that economic growth is kind of wavering right now in China, certainly the party would prefer not to have to deal with the trade war. But they could get along without it. And I think given the direction that the government has taken over the past few years under Xi Jinping, the party could probably manage dissent pretty handily. There's been a big crackdown in China against dissent. There's been a narrowing of the, what would you call it, open space, I guess, in society. There's been, you know, civil society has been narrowed considerably over the past few years, and it's not like it was really big to begin with. So I think the government has been increasing its powers of censorship and its ability to crack down on dissent over the past few years. So they put themselves in a position where if there were mass dissent, they could probably deal with it pretty easily. I don't know how many people are following events in Xinjiang, which is the western province with the ethnic Uyghurs in China. But there's some, I've been reading some articles that have suggested there might be as many as 1 million people that have been put in, well, have been detained, shall we say, in Xinjiang as part of a general crackdown on what the government would call religious extremism. That's when the government admits there's a problem at all, which it generally doesn't, but when it does, it generally references the need to crack down on religious extremism of one sort or another. And that has been expanding tremendously, apparently. From what little we get out of Xinjiang, that would appear to be the case, and it may be that a significant proportion, maybe 5 to 10% of the Uyghur population is now effectively detained under suspicion of being separatist or extremist of one sort or another. It's not hard to be considered an extremist when the criteria are so mild. You know, even something as mild as having a beard can be considered suspect. So that gives you an idea of the capacity for repression within China's authoritarian regime. I don't think they would have any qualms about using that on the broader population, should the need arise. Certainly Tiananmen Square illustrated that, for anybody who missed that event. So I don't think the government is too afraid. They would rather not deal with mass dissent than deal with it, certainly. You know, the government isn't stupid. They would prefer to avoid any kind of significant conflagration that would diminish the party's prestige in the eyes of the public. But I don't think that I don't think the trade war is going to be a catalyst for significant dissent. Again, they've still got trade with Europe. Most of the economic growth, most of China's economy is not tied in with exports and imports. I think it's down to 10-15%. The big problem in China's economy right now, and the bigger focus of the Communist Party of China's attention, has been the over-reliance on investment. There's been too much reliance on investment as a kind of economic driver of last resort, where imports and exports and where domestic consumption has flagged. The big example being after 2008, during the big global economic downturn, the government almost always turns to investment to try to float the economy and mitigate unemployment, mitigate the fall in wages, et cetera, that normally is correspondent with an economic downturn. But they've done it so much and so frequently over the past 15, 20 years that the financial sector is starting to feel the strain. There's just been state-owned enterprises make up too big a chunk of the economy, and they're not efficient enough. They've taken on too much leverage, and that's to say nothing of all the leverage that's been taken on by local government. Not nearly as much as the state-owned enterprises, but it's enough to add to the problem and create an overarching issue with leverage in the Chinese economy. So deleveraging, reducing the amount of debt held by state-owned enterprises and by local government has been the big effort, the big economic reform effort that's been made over the past few years. You could argue that they would have made more hay if they just liberalized the economy, but that's a whole other conversation. But the party is most concerned about dealing with that issue. And so it's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place now. There's too much leverage in the economy to really risk a significant increase in investment again if the economy suffers another downturn. But there's not really any other tools in the box that the party is comfortable with. So what do? I mean, they can liberalize the economy or do something to deal with that, but then there's going to be an economic downturn and the party risks political backlash of some kind. And the party is very risk averse, such that almost any kind of political backlash is considered undesirable. On the other hand, they can just do another round of investment stimulus, but then that risks destabilizing the financial sector to the point of potential collapse. I mean, there's already such a strain on the financial sector that a lot of lending in China happens in the black market, what they call the shadow banking sector. And trying to corral that has also been another effort. They recently had to stop their effort to mitigate the shadow banking sector because they wanted to start increasing investment again to try to deal with the sluggishness in China's economy. So I think a major economic downturn is considered more of the existential threat. In so much as the trade war contributes to that, they might see it as a threat, but not the trade war in and of itself, I don't think. There's just an overarching issue in China with the health of the economy, and more accurately, the structure of the economy and the trajectory of the economy that the party is more worried about. The big plan for the party's big ambition is to have the Chinese economy evolve into a developed economy that is a player in technology and innovation, and that is a center of those things, that is a center of innovation and technology in the world, and that has industries that dominate new industries, new emergent industries. That's the goal. But whether or not they can actually do that is still kind of in question. And that's one of the reasons that I don't think the Chinese government is going to negotiate in Trump's trade war. For them, they're being risk averse. They want more than anything to develop those innovative, technologically advanced industries that will dominate the industries of the future. But because they're not entirely confident that can happen in a completely liberalized free market setup, they're going to trade away probably tighter trade links with the United States in exchange for the de facto right to basically develop their quote-unquote national champions, basically cultivate protected industries in these, what they would consider key strategic industries of the future. If doing that means they have to have higher tariffs with the United States, then they'll probably just say, so be it. And they'll trade whatever economic growth is commensurate with that accordingly. For the party, the potential gains of having a developed economy in the future outweigh anything that they might lose in the short term from a loss of, from tariffs that could be asserted by the Trump administration, and maybe also Europe even. If the United States had taken a multilateral approach and gotten all of China's trade partners together and applied trade pressure, maybe then the party would have acquiesced somewhat. But I think even then they would have done it ambiguously. They might have just continued to do it in secret. That's kind of the trouble with China's political system. There's not a clear divide between the government and the private sector. The party is kind of everywhere. So if the party wants something, they don't have to pass a law to do it. They can just apply pressure through informal networks. That's kind of how they do the technology transfer thing that they're getting accused of, and that they actually do. There's not really any law in China that says you have to trade technology to a local Chinese partner if you want access to China's market. That's actually an implicit rule that's kind of enforced by the party informally, which makes it difficult then to judge whether or not they're actually adhering to any promise to stop doing that. Because any company that refuses to partner with a company without technology transfers can just say, hey, this is just in our best interest, we're not going to do it otherwise. And if you can't get into the Chinese market without doing that, then the Chinese government can just say, oh, well, the reason that they're not succeeding in our market is not because we're enforcing some technology transfer regime, de facto regime, it's because they just can't compete. They're not good enough to compete in the Chinese market, and they're just crying foul to get special treatment. Now, which of those is true comes down to a judgment call. And it's not going to be very clear. The government of China will go out of their way to ambiguate and to make that a difficult judgment call to make.
What you just said was a really articulate way of saying mad because you bad.
What? Said
mad?
What?
You're mad because you bad, lol. You can't play in our market. You're just complaining. But
well, that's exactly it. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly the defense that they would raise in that case. So, yeah, I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had about the U.S. trading relationship with China and how to manage economic relations with China. That's something we can get into if somebody wants to. But, I'm already off on like 3 degrees of separation from what we were originally talking about. I'm not even... What was it? Oh, existential threat, trade, China. Yeah. So I don't... For the reasons that I elaborated, I don't think the party really sees it as an existential threat. It is a threat, but not an existential one, and probably not even really a substantive one. It's just annoying, probably. The Communist Party of China has bigger plans for China and its economy than just trade with the United States. They have other plans in play, and they would rather sacrifice trade with the U.S. than sacrifice those plans. And, again, that ties into a much bigger overarching conversation about U.S., Sino-U.S. economic ties, but we can save that for later. For now, my answer basically to this question/comment would be basically that. Let's see, the next question was, I'm down for a conversation about the fall of the USSR. Let's see. It's a dangerously ambiguous thing to say, because that gives me lots of leeway. Because I can go a long time about that subject.
Well, before we've done some, like, World War I in 10 minutes or less kind of thing, so, okay, fall of the USSR, 10 minutes or less, go.
Okay. So roughly, I'm not even sure I can remember all of the major factors, but roughly, for one, there's oil prices. The Soviet Union was very dependent on oil prices and exports of oil and gas for foreign currency, which it needed to import certain goods that it was not really able to produce itself. Grain being one example, sundry other goods and services also. But as oil prices in the 1980s collapsed, the USSR lost a huge source of foreign currency, and that created a strain on their economy. It didn't create necessarily a huge strain, but it was already under strain because of its own internal contradictions and inefficiencies. So that was a contributing factor. probably one of the major factors, if not the factor, was just the structure of the Soviet economy in general. This was not the only factor. I'll get into the others in a minute, but I just want to recognize that inefficiency and mismanagement in a command economy. I mean, command economies are almost always mismanaged and inefficient, but the Soviet Union was in a class of its own in that regard. You know, after 70 years of trying and failing to manage a command economy, everything was kind of coming to a head. Nothing was working. The distribution networks were massively inefficient. I think I read somewhere that something like 40% of food was lost in transit, just fell off of trucks, basically.
Wow.
Or maybe it was a particular type of food. I don't remember exactly what the statistic was, but basically just massive inefficiency, and that in conjunction with poor distribution. You know, a lot of goods were siphoned off to the black market, and things like that basically created rationing. And when I say rationing, basically, if you've ever seen pictures of huge lines in the Soviet Union of people waiting to try to get goods, many times getting to the head of the line and finding that there actually weren't any more goods left. That's an example of rationing. There's not enough goods for all of the people who want them. You know, people who lived through that time have stories about, you know, just waiting hours and hours in line just to get something like toilet paper. And if you could get it, it was like a treasure because it was super hard to find.
Treasure paper.
Yeah, I mean, just even the simplest of things, consumer goods, were very difficult to find. And so that economically created a huge strain on the Soviet government because the government just couldn't really handle the problem. And trying to manage that problem was one of the reasons that Gorbachev liberalized the economy in the first place. That was an effort to just try to deal with that because the usual means of trying to ameliorate the problem through the command economy approach to managing economics just wasn't working anymore. And so there was a sense that there needed to be a change. But that massive inefficiency was a big problem in and of its own self, in its own right. There was also just general, I mean, this is kind of an amorphous thing, but there was general, what would you call it? Bad morale, almost. There was a sense amongst the broader population in the Soviet Union that there wasn't any point in it. Discontent. Put it like, well, even more than that, a malaise. It was just a general sense that things were not going well, that the country was in the wrong direction, and that there wasn't any reason to try anymore. You know, a lot of people kind of phoned it in at work. This is another problem with the Soviet command economy. You're basically guaranteed a job. And if you're guaranteed a job, why work hard? And in earlier generations, especially the first generation or two of the Soviet Union, there were people who did work hard because they remembered what life was like before. And they had a sense that this was progress, that they were building something better, etc. But by the 1980s, that sort of, what would you call it? Enthusiasm. That enthusiasm was long gone, and just a lot of people just phoned it in every day. And that also increased, you know, inefficiency in the economy. So low oil prices, inefficiencies in the economy, and then there was Gorbachev, who presented a unique difficulty to the Soviet political system that it ultimately could not manage. And what I mean by that is that Mikhail Gorbachev not only tried to liberalize the economy, he tried to liberalize the political system. And that created a whole bunch of political tensions within Soviet society that ultimately could not be managed. Gorbachev himself believed that the broader public of the Soviet Union, and actually Eastern Europe as well, would vote for the Communist Party, given the choice. He thought the party was legitimately popular and was legitimate, and it would not be seen as that people would not turn on the party if there was some democratization within the Soviet Union. So from his perspective, introducing democracy would allow more accountability and would reveal the inefficiencies in the system and allow them to be dealt with, at the same time as keeping the Communist Party in power. He didn't think it would lead to a significant challenge in the way that it did. Now there's two major corollaries to that. For one, Gorbachev was not entirely interested in just opening up society to deal with problems. It was also a power play. Within the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, after Stalin's death, there was a set of informal norms instituted within the party. And those norms basically regarded preventing the rise of one major leader like Stalin. They didn't want a repeat of Stalin where you had just one guy ruling over everybody else. So there was an informal norm instituted in the 1950s, wherein you couldn't do that. Basically no one guy should have too much power, and nobody tried to do that. It was just understood that you did not do that. And nobody did for much of that period after Stalin's death, until Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev saw himself as a reformer who had to cut through the red tape. He had to cut through all this bureaucracy. There was just too much resistance to reform to make it viable, and so if you wanted real reform, you had to get tough. That was Gorbachev's perspective. But because he had that perspective, he ended up disregarding that norm, and that ended up making him something of a pariah within the party. He had a lot of power within the party. He had a lot of, powerful contacts, networking, etc. You have to be to become premier of the Soviet Union. But he created a lot of discontent within the party by doing those things, by basically shoving reform down the throats of his opposition in the party. So by breaking that norm, he created basically the Soviet equivalent of a constitutional crisis. He created a setup where people were afraid that he was going to become a new Stalin. And so part of those political reforms that Gorbachev instituted were not only meant for legitimate reform reasons, they were also partly meant to put pressure on his rivals. Because he knew that his rivals were involved in, some variety of corruption. Everybody was in the Soviet Union, no surprise. But by opening up that space to criticize the party, he also had in mind opening up that space for people to criticize his rival. And he used that criticism that invariably was generated as a bludgeon against them. Now, on the one hand, this helped him implement his reform agenda and get past his opposition, but it also created massive concern in the party because it made a lot of people in the party feel like he was becoming dictator, and nobody wanted to return to Stalin. And so a big reason for the eventual coup against Gorbachev was not just Soviet hardliners, frustrated that, the economy was being liberalized and that the party's monopoly on politics was evaporating. Part of that coup was also a desire to prevent another Stalin. It was a sense that this guy was becoming a dictator and they had to stop it. But because Gorbachev had opened up society, politically and economically, there was massive resistance to that coup, and so they ended up shooting themselves in the foot. Basically, there was miscalculation on the part of everybody involved about the amount of opposition to party rule that would be generated by political liberalization. Neither Gorbachev nor his opponents really fully understood those forces that had been unleashed. And so that brings me to the second corollary I mentioned, which is what was called at the time the nationalities problem. In the Soviet Union, the birth rate among ethnic Russians was pretty low. The highest birth rates in the Soviet Union were from non-Russian ethnicities, and this created a growing concern among certain Russian nationalists within the Soviet Union. Now, so long as there was a one-party state and there was no political liberalization, that concern did not have voice. But when Gorbachev opened up the political system, it did. And that saw the rebirth of Russian nationalism. And Russian nationalism probably did more than anything to kill the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin and the Russian nationalists who ended up winning broadly the elections in the Soviet Union in the, early 90s or so, they get painted in the West as democratizers, reformers, liberals. That's not entirely accurate. Actually, they were somewhat illiberal nationalists. They were hardened ethnic nationalists who, while giving space to economic and political liberals within their political coalition, were mostly ethnic nationalists. That was kind of their principal issue. And that's what they got elected on. And there was a lot of other parties and groups like that around the Soviet Union in the various Soviet republics, like what was then the Kazakhs, Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukraine, Lithuania especially, big nationalists in Lithuania. A lot of those nationalities voted for ethnic nationalist parties, and including the Russians. And the political tensions that were created from that and the political momentum that ethnic nationalist parties got in the Soviet Union surprised everybody, especially the communists, because the communists kind of thought people were above that. They didn't think that would happen. And so that was the big surprise. That was sort of the big counterforce that jumped out of political liberalization that caught Gorbachev off guard. He didn't really foresee that, and he had no real answer to it. And the mistake that Gorbachev's opponents made was not really understanding that either. You know, they thought that if they could just reimpose authoritarian rule and shut all of this reform down, they could pretty easily reestablish control. But they miscalculated the degree to which Soviet society had changed under the reforms, even in just a few years. You know, had been sufficiently opened up that the new political forces, the reformist political forces, broadly speaking, had enough legitimacy and power to basically fight back and support Boris Yeltsin in resisting the coup. And if they'd been smarter, they would have kind of calculated for that and launched something more like a soft coup. They would have maneuvered within the party to remove Gorbachev and then taken power that way, in a way that was more legal. By launching a hard coup, they painted themselves as hardliners that were in direct opposition to the nascent political forces in the Soviet Union. It would have been a lot smarter to try to work more with them. But they didn't do that because, again, hardliners, and because they were, again, from the coup's perspective, it was more of an internal party matter against Gorbachev. It was an internal party move to try to unseat Gorbachev. They weren't really thinking in the broader political perspective. And to be fair to them, given that they'd all grown up in a one-party state, they probably weren't really familiar with the dynamics of political coalition building and whatnot. So that was probably well outside their mental wheelhouse. But all of that kind of combined together to completely destabilize the political system and open up the avenue that ended up being taken by Boris Yeltsin and the other leaders of the various Soviet republics, which was to basically just declare the Soviet Union null and void. They basically just declared independence, and that was it. And Boris Yeltsin was one of those guys, by the way. It was not just the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, etc., declaring independence and that being the end of the Soviet Union. Russia itself declared independence from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union without Russia is not really much. It's basically just a bureaucracy without any country to govern. And so that was why Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. He had no country to govern. There almost wasn't anything to resign from at that point. You know, once what became the Russian Federation and all the other constituent republics left the Soviet Union, that was it. And even that was partly even that itself had tied into the nationalities problem. Excuse me. You know, a lot of the republics, like the Ukraine and Belarus, had no interest in staying in a republic, in a Soviet Union that would be dominated by Russia, specifically Russian nationalists. You know, so long as it was communist, then it's kind of manageable, but ethnic Russian nationalists, not everybody is entirely comfortable with that. So part of the reason the Soviets broke up, specifically in the months leading up to the breakup, had to do with tensions between the constituent republics and an uber-powerful Russia. I mean, Russia was easily the most powerful Soviet republic within the Soviet Union. So if Russian nationalists were to gain control of it, they would easily basically be the predominant political force within the Soviet Union writ large. And it was unclear what repercussions that would have in the future for Soviet policy. So in conjunction with the general rise of nationalist parties and their unsurprising desire for autonomy, if not independence, there was also this fear amongst political elites within the constituent republics of Russian domination, specifically ethnic Russian domination beyond just communist Russian domination. So that was also a contributing factor. That was more than 10 minutes, wasn't it?
It was about 14. Not bad, though.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there was a lot that went on.
Yeah, there was quite a bit that went on. You know, there was also other little things like the war in Afghanistan, which kind of sapped the Soviet budget. And that also contributed to the malaise amongst the broader Soviet population, because it was just sort of this war that dragged on and killed lots of people. There was also Star Wars, not the movie, but rather the Reagan program. The Reagan administration introduced a program to create a anti-ballistic missile system, as well as assorted other space-based technologies. It was called Star Wars at the time. And there was a sense then that there was a kind of technological arms race, as well as a normal arms race. The Reagan administration in the 1980s also significantly increased military spending. So the Soviets felt somewhat compelled to respond, but found that they were not really entirely able to. You know, there was the resources required to match the U.S. arms buildup, to say nothing of the technological and economic resources that would be necessary to match Star Wars. And the technology that it represented was just beyond the capacity of the Soviet economy at that point. And it was at that juncture that reformists started to gain political ground within the Communist Party. in sort of the mid 80s or so. It also helped that a lot of the old guard had died off. There was after Brezhnev died in the early 80s, I think it was. Brezhnev was the premier of the Soviet Union for like 20 years. It was a long time. After he died, two other older guys, basic guys in their 60s and 70s, took power. One of them had been head of the KGB, I think. Yuri Antropov, I think was his name. And the other guy, I don't remember. He was kind of... After Brezhnev died, the next guy was in office 6 months before he died, and then Antropov came in and died after like a year and a half. So that wiped out basically the old guard, and most of the younger guys were more inclined to be more reformist. And that's when Mikhail Gorbachev came into power. So those were all kind of those were also contributing factors kind of on the side. And those are generally the ones that get more attention. But hopefully that's kind of a coherent, I hope that was sufficiently coherent explanation of at least some of the different factors involved. I'm sure there were others, I'm not an expert, but those are the ones that I remember reading about.
Well, thank you.
Now we know more.
And again, if anybody has something to contribute, some criticism or some further elaboration, please do throw it in chat. Please do contribute. I would love hearing other perspectives on the issue. Let's see. So the next question was, do you think the Democrats care about the debt? It depends. If you're saying, do Democratic politicians care about the debt, I would say yes. It's kind of their job. I mean, whatever political theater happens, fundamentally all politicians, congressmen basically care about the debt. They just kind of differ on how much is acceptable and how much of it should be spent on what. If you're asking if Democrat supporters or Democrat voters care about debt, you'd have to ask them, for one. That's the short answer to that. I imagine it would vary from person. It varies from person to person, almost certainly. Some people care a lot, some people don't. Some people don't know anything about it. Some people know a lot about it. There's a whole spectrum there that you're going to find if you look. So there's no easy answer on that. If you're asking whether the Democratic Party cares about the debt, I don't know that they care as much about it politically. It's not one of their core issues. The Democratic Party doesn't really consider deficit spending or the deficit in general to be one of their major motivating issues, at least for their voters. The Republican Party kind of does that more. That's more in their sort of fiscal wheelhouse, small government ideology. So it just kind of depends on the answer to the question kind of depends on what you mean by the Democrats. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of read that. So roughly, that would be my answer then. Just those would be the three principal groups I could think of thinking about quote unquote the Democrats and their perspectives, their various perspectives on debt as an issue.
There's also the connection to the point you made later of if you're a president and the economy does well, they usually think well of you in some capacity. For the Democrats who don't have the executive office right now, if the country kind of gets worse and the public gets upset, that sort of works in their favor for the next presidential cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
exactly
one reason why they wouldn't be super mad if things got worse during this immediate term. But in the next term, and I think over the long term, neither party really enjoys debt as something like, yeah, let's get more debt.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I don't think debt is something people pursue in and of itself. It's more the result of political negotiations, compromises, or specific projects, like a big military buildup or a new social program or something like that. So generally, if there's a lot of debt, there's a story behind it. There's a reason it's there. It's not always a good reason, but there is a reason. It's not generally an issue unto itself. Let's see. Can you talk about immigration and how it is changing globally, the tensions it is causing, and the causes behind the changes in immigration norms? Does climate change factor into the immigration changes? If it does, how so? Okay, let me think here. Can you talk about immigration and how it is changing globally? I don't know. I don't know that it's really taken off a whole lot. It has increased over the past few decades, but I don't know that it's really significantly above trend. There was a big influx of people into Europe in, what was it, 2014, 2015, kind of around there. But immigration has kind of tailed off pretty substantively since then. Whether or not it's too high still or not, that's kind of a political question for Europeans to decide amongst themselves. Have fun with that.
Good luck.
But it is down significantly. There's not a lot of immigration into East Asia. There's not a lot of immigration into South Asia, although there is the, what do you call them? In Myanmar, that one group, Rohingya. No, that's kind of an ambiguous issue because the Burmese say they're immigrants, the Rohingya say, no, we've been here a long time. What are you doing? So that's kind of a whole debate there. But yeah, there is immigration as an issue in South Asia. But I don't think it's increasing substantively. I don't think the patterns are really changing. That's more or less on track. I don't think there's been a significant change in the Middle East. I think it's mostly still migrant workers from South Asia there in the Middle East. I think Dubai is almost a caste system where the local Arabs are on top, and then the professional middle class is kind of more European or more cosmopolitan, and then the bottom rung is Pakistanis and Indians mostly, maybe some Filipinos as well. But that hasn't significantly increased or decreased, I don't think. So I don't think that's a big change. I mean, if there's been a change in North America, it's been a decrease. I think pretty much since the 2008 financial crisis, immigration from Mexico has been on the decline. There might have been some variance here and there, but I think overall the trend is downward. There's been more from Central America recently, but hardly anybody lives in Central America, so that's not a big change in and of itself. My apologies if you're from Central America. I don't mean to sound disparaging, but the population of Central America is 10 million, what, 10, 20 million? It's not huge. So the immigration flows from Central America don't really tilt the scales that much. I don't think there's the most immigration you'll see in South America is probably from Venezuela. That's becoming more and more an issue there. More and more people trying to get out and creating something of a refugee/migrant crisis, however you want to paint that. Yeah, my impression is not that there's a huge change in immigration per se over the past 5 to 10 years. Now, if you want to talk about the past 50 years, then yeah, there's definitely huge increases in flows of people across borders. Europe alone is an example of that. Just the creation of the European Union and the Schengen zone represents significant change. Although you could argue it's actually a reversion, what would you call it, a reversion to mean. Since before World War I, Europe actually had not free flow of people, but much freer flow of people than we saw in much of the 20th century. But yeah, Europe over the past 50 years has seen a lot more immigration between countries. There's been a lot more immigration outside of Europe too. That's kind of the example of what would you call them? Migrant workers from Turkey in the case of Germany. I think in France's case it was more from Algeria. And then in the UK's case there was the Windrush generation, people from the West Indies, basically Jamaica for the most part, but probably also other parts of the Caribbean. And then India, I think Britain also got a lot of people from India and Pakistan. Has been getting a lot of migrants from India and Pakistan over the past few decades. So there is some non-European migration flow into Europe. I don't think it's really that huge, though. I know there's people who complain that it's going to change the ethnic face of Europe, but that seems pretty unlikely to me. There's this notion that if you opened up borders completely, then all 5 billion people outside of Europe would just move to Europe, but that's not true. That's just logistically, for one, that's not plausible. Two, there's enough economic opportunity to prevent most of those people from living. That's not to say a lot of people wouldn't take the opportunity, but it's not all of them, for sure. Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's a broad question, so I'm trying to encompass as much as I can. In Europe's case, yeah, there's a lot of flows, but the most likely outcome there is that the population of migrants either goes back where they came from, or they make money, or second generation or third generation their children make more money and end up assimilating somewhat, if not completely, probably completely, and end up with a lower birth rate themselves. But we've talked a bit about this before. You know, if you really want lower birth rates among immigrants, if that is something you're concerned about, the best thing you can do is ensure the economic prosperity of the immigrants themselves, because a recurring phenomena in developed countries is that the higher your income, the lower your birth rate. So if you really want low birth rates for immigrants, make sure that their kids or their kids' kids have moved up the ladder, so to speak, and have decent to well-paying jobs, because then they'll be subject to those same forces. It's not something you only see in Western countries. You know, just any country that reaches developed status almost invariably sees lower birth rates. I mean, you can Singapore, South Korea, Japan, you know, everywhere. The only exception would be the Middle East, and that's because they have oil. You know, those economies are not really developed. They just have a lot of money from selling oil. That's different. And you can even see the phenomena in Mexico. You don't even have to reach developed status. Just improving your economy puts downward pressure on birth rates. You know, the birth rate in Mexico way back in the early 20th century was very high. I think it was something around 10 children per, what was it, 10 births per female? I forget the technical statistic for it. Fertility rates are actually different from birth rates. I'm having trouble remembering which one it was, but basically it was high. And then as the Mexican economy developed over the subsequent, you know, half century, you know, up till now, the birth rate has steadily fallen. And right now it's still growing. It's still above replacement rate. I think it's like 2.5 or something, between 2 to 3. But it's a lot smaller than it used to be, and it's still shrinking. Basically, the better off the Mexican economy gets, the lower it gets. Obviously, there's variance there, I'm sure, from region to region, but overall it's downward. So that's kind of the takeaway. So I don't think the inflow of immigrants into Europe, or the United States for that matter, is any kind of, you know, ethnic or cultural challenge of any sort over the long term. There will be short-term changes of some, you know, of some variety, but I don't think any substantive change. Let's see, so, you know, again, talking about how immigration is changing globally is a kind of an ambiguous question. So that's roughly my review of it. The tensions it is causing, you know, the tensions it causes come down principally, I guess it varies from place to place though. You know, in the case of South Asia, it's more religious. You know, actually this might be a good time to talk about it. There's a province in eastern India called Assam. And the Indian government recently reviewed, I guess is the word. They tried to figure out who was a citizen and who wasn't. And if they couldn't find good reason to think that you were a citizen, then they basically identified you as a non-citizen. They stripped your citizenship, basically. And the thing about India and a lot of countries outside the Western Hemisphere is that citizenship is granted by birth or descent. It's not granted by where you're from, like it is in the West. In the Western Hemisphere, they're much more liberal about handing out citizenship. Like if you're born in country, that's enough. You're a citizen automatically if you're just born in the country. But in a place like India, you have to actually be descended from people from the country. You know, citizenship has to be passed down. It's much harder to get citizenship if you're from outside the country. And so in India, there was a suspicion, there's been a long-running tension in Assam regarding Bengalis, who are suspected of coming over the border from Bangladesh and changing the demographic and cultural nature of the province. And so the Assamese are always, you know, demanding that the government do something about it, crack down about it. And the Indian government finally did. And what they've done is basically strip citizenship from something like 4 million people, which is a huge number. That is not a small number at all. And that could presage significant instability in Assam going forward. Because 4 million stateless people is a problem just in general. 4 million stateless people in one concentrated area is a crisis. You know, and the Indian government has already talked about building detainment camps to try to manage them. That's going to go over about as well as you can expect. You know, it's just a big mess. But that's an example of tension. The Bengalis kind of crossing the border, maybe not, depends on who you talk to. I'm not going to get into that right now, but basically there's a sense that the ethnography of Assam was changing, and the native Assamese felt threatened by it because that's their territory, and they don't want interlopers basically coming in. There's also religious tension. Islam has a reputation as a proselytizing religion, and there's a sense amongst the Buddhists and Christians of Assam that the Muslims were coming in and taking over the province and converting everybody. Religious sensitivities obviously exacerbate ethnic tensions, and that's an example there. Rohingya is kind of something similar. But basically, the tensions often come down to people being different. There's an ethnic difference. There's a sense that you don't know whether you can trust the newcomers. There's a sense that you can't communicate as well with them. It comes down to trust in a lot of cases. Again, if there's pre-existing ethnic or religious tension, then it's not really about immigration. it's a pre-existing tension in that case, and immigration just kind of exacerbates it. But in a case like the US or Europe, there's not really as much pre-existing tension with a lot of the groups coming in. Really, it comes more down to trust. Can we trust these people? And it'll take time to kind of acclimate, to build that trust between communities. But once they do, there will be assimilation. And over the course of 20, 30 years, the problem just kind of, what's the word I want? I was trying to think of it earlier. Disintegrates. Let's go with that. It's not coming to mind. But yeah, over time, it'll diminish. It'll just kind of go with time, that tension. It's kind of a meandering answers to meandering questions. That's kind of a common theme.
That's what we do here.
Does climate change factor into the immigration changes? Yes, I'm sure it contributes something, but it's not a major contributor. Most of the immigrants are being motivated by economic factors. They're looking for opportunity. In the case like the Philippines, there's a lot of people who have trouble finding work, and so they go to the Middle East, or they go to Hong Kong, or wherever to act as maids or low-wage workers. So that's flows of immigration like that are the predominant form. You'll see big temporary spikes in immigration from things like wars or disasters or something like, obviously Syria is the big example there. The Syrian civil war generated a huge wave of immigrants back in 2015, 2016, whenever it was. But that's tailed off considerably since then. There comes a point when you just kind of reach an equilibrium. But economic factors are kind of recurring. There's always more people looking for better opportunities. So that's more the principal driver there. Climate change, you'll see some, but I haven't seen any big examples yet. Maybe in the future, but right now it's not quite the principal driver. If it does, how so? So in so much as climate change is a factor, some of it comes down to, part of this comes down to how much weather behavior. You can tell I'm not a climate scientist. You'll be able to tell very easily I'm not a climate scientist. It's not something I've studied a whole lot, but this is part of what I'm about to say is going to depend on how much you trust, how much weather behavior patterns you attribute to climate change. That's a word salad. But in so much as you attribute things like increased droughts or heat or what have you to climate change, then that is probably the principal factor. If you can't grow food, that's a problem. So you got to go somewhere else. You got to go get wage work to try to buy what you need, or you have to go somewhere else where you can grow food. There's also the issue of rising oceans, rising water levels, but that's not really a big enough issue to kind of drive significant immigration yet. So that's not a big factor. It's more, I think, down to drought. I suspect that would be the bigger thing. Drought was one of the contributing factors to the Syrian civil war. Kind of unsung because it's not as sexy, but that was one of the factors. So I suspect that would be the principal driver of climate change-based immigration. But again, I don't think there's a whole lot of that right now. There's just not the big flows you see are either economic or temporary spikes from conflicts. Let's see. So those are some rough impressions there. I hope I kind of got to the crux of the question. I apologize if not. If I ever don't quite get the question right, please feel free to elaborate, and I can come back to it. Let's see. So the next one was, do you think the biggest reason why Germany lost World War II is because they attacked Russia without proper preparation, clothing because of the winter? I think that was a reason, but it was not the principal reason. I think the biggest reason they lost World War II is you can go all day. This is one of those things that historians will just argue with each other incessantly about. I don't think there's ever going to be one big thing that you can kind of point to. There's a number of factors. Certainly, poor preparation was a contributing factor. But I think a bigger problem was just the overarching strategic balance between Germany and the Soviet Union and the Allies in general. I think there was a lot of arrogance amongst, Hitler. Hitler specifically was very arrogant about Germany's ability to finish the war. And I think a lot of that came from before the war. Hitler proposed what was the first crisis? I think the first crisis was the Sudetenland, wasn't it? No, it was before that. It was the mid-30s, and it was the Rhineland. For those not familiar with the Treaty of Versailles and some of the provisions, one of the provisions was that the Rhineland had to be demilitarized. Germany could not have any military forces in the Rhineland. And there was one part of the Rhineland called the Saar that was particularly industrious. It had a lot of industry. And that actually got carved out of Germany entirely and basically became a French protectorate. I think technically it was supposed to be a League of Nations mandate or some damn thing, but basically a French protectorate. So what Hitler did is he proposed to basically just march the German army right into the Rhineland and to reoccupy it. And that was supposed to be kind of a signal to his supporters as well as to the rest of the world that Germany was kind of restoring its dignity, taking its proper place in Europe again. And the response should have been for France to mobilize its military and respond in kind to make sure that Germany adhered to the Treaty of Versailles. But there was a reluctance to do so. There was no desire to start a war, and there was some sympathy for Germany, especially in Britain. There was a sense that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, that the French had been too hard on them specifically, and that maybe they should kind of take it easy and kind of let Germany have some concession. Now, there was an expectation, there was a fear amongst the Hitler and the German military that the Allies would respond with force, and they actually planned fully to withdraw if they had done so. They had no intention of starting a conflict over the Rhineland. So it was a gamble that paid off, and so that kind of emboldened Hitler a bit. So later on, during the Sudeten crisis, when Germany and Hitler were trying to carve the Sudetenland out of Czechoslovakia, Hitler again figured, okay, if they actually push us, we'll fall back, but let's make this gamble. Let's actually try this. And the German military was dead against it. Most of the officer corps thought it was crazy, that this would result in war, that the British and French would invade Germany, and that it was a big mess. Because the German military at that point was not ready for war. The French and British militaries were not in great shape, but they were certainly better than what Germany had on offer at the time. So the officer corps almost killed Hitler over that. From what I remember reading in some of Winston Churchill's books about in one of Winston Churchill's books about World War II, about this time period, he talks about a cohort of officers that actually planned to overthrow Hitler if he tried to do it and if it went south. And when I say went south, I mean if it went wrong, if a war threatened to emerge. But it didn't. The Allies kind of acquiesced. There was the Munich conference, and the German officer corps was shocked. They couldn't believe that the British would just kind of roll over like that. But they did, and so that created some confidence, not only on the part of the officer corps, that, maybe this Hitler guy actually knows what he's doing. It also created a lot more confidence in Hitler. Hitler himself thought, okay, these guys, they're just going to keep rolling over. We can do this, no problem. So then Poland happened, and that was a bit surprising, but they had a plan. And the plan worked way better than anybody expected. The fact that France fell in 6 weeks shocked the world. It certainly shocked the Germans. They were not expecting things to end that quickly. So everybody was thoroughly surprised, and at that point, the German military and Hitler kind of had the sense that, okay, this is their moment. we're a people of destiny. We can just keep on going, and we're just going to keep winning. And so at that point, that's when the arrogance really emerged, and there was a sense that they didn't really have to worry about how the war would end, because in their minds it was already over. Obviously the invasion of Britain didn't work out, but there was a very real sense, not only in Germany, but in France, and the rest of the world, that there was no way Britain could beat Germany without France. Without France acting as sort of the tank, so to speak. Without France really fighting the land war, Britain wasn't thought to have a real fighting chance. And so Germany didn't really, the German leadership didn't really feel any qualms about turning attention away from Britain to Russia. It was thought, okay, the British can't really do anything, the United States is staying out of it, let's go fight the Russians. And we'll put them down easily. And, that we've talked a bit about it before. The Russians performed rather badly in World War I. The Germans kind of overperformed. They did much better than they'd expected. And so some of that sentiment that the Russians could easily be beaten had lasted. That was sort of the attitude at the time, that, we'll invade the Soviet Union, they'll fold, it'll be easy, and then we'll just kind of be masters. We'll kind of have it at that point. The war will be over. And that sense of arrogance is really what did them in, because obviously the Soviets were not, they didn't roll over. We could do a whole thing about the Eastern Front. I'm tempted to do a podcast about it. I'm an old Eastern Front armchair general. That was one of my favorite topics as a kid. So if anybody wants to talk about it, I'm game. Feel free to ask questions. It's a lot of fun. But for the Germans, that was a, if not the big mistake. Invading the Soviet Union was just a huge act of hubris. They had terrible intelligence leading up to it. It was just a bad idea to begin with, regardless of how well they prepared for it. And that's in conjunction with underestimating the British Empire, which was still quite large and powerful, and underestimating the ability of the United States and Germany not the United States and Germany, the United States and Britain, to build up their militaries relatively quickly and to launch a significant offensive relatively quickly. Obviously not as fast as the Soviets would have liked, but they did what they could. And the United States also had that other war it was fighting at the same time that was draining resources. So, to be fair to the United States, fighting two wars at once is not easy. But I think, in general, you could say arrogance, but even saying just arrogance is kind of a cop-out answer, because, again, a lot of different factors at play. There was the fact that Germany did not fight a total war right away. Germany did not mobilize its economy onto a total war footing, I think, until 1942. Several years after the war had started in 1939. The Soviets, in contrast, were full tilt from the start. They were mobilized for total war even before the war had kind of started. They were already building up, they were pumping out material. The Soviets actually had a major military reorganization in place, underway, when the invasion happened. The Soviets figured a war was going to happen sooner or later, and so they started reorganizing and introducing new equipment, new strategies, new tactics, new officers, etc. But the Germans kind of hit right in the middle of it. I remember reading one historian say that if the Germans had invaded 1 year earlier or 1 year later, it would have failed, just outright in that first year. Because a year earlier, the Germans themselves were really not ready for an invasion of the Soviet Union, and the German military was still building up. In fact, Hitler himself, this was also in one of Winston Churchill's books, the German leadership, Hitler and the military leadership, were planning on a war around 1943 or 44. Starting the war in 39 was way early. The German military was not fully prepared. It was not fully built up. So that's an example of how the German military was not ready to invade the Soviet Union in 1940. But if they'd invaded a year later, in 1942, the Soviets would have finished the reorganization. They would have had much better equipment. They would have been much better deployed. And this is kind of getting off in a tangent, but basically, invading the Soviet Union was a huge mistake, to put it mildly. But the lack of preparedness of the German military specifically, the lack of preparedness, the questioner mentioned earlier, the lack of clothing for winter. There's a lot of little things. We can get into it if somebody wants to, but because it's a complicated topic. But I don't think, short answer to the question is, no, I do not think lack of preparation was the biggest reason why Germany lost World War II. That's the short answer. Let's see. Do you think the United States is currently in or could soon enter a constitutional crisis? How would a constitutional crisis play out in this political climate? Could it? It could. I think the United States could enter a constitutional crisis pretty easily. But I don't think it would be on purpose. I don't, again, Donald Trump just doesn't strike me as a maniacal mastermind. If he causes if Donald Trump causes a constitutional crisis, I suspect it would probably be by accident. And I think in that case, he would probably back off pretty quickly, because I would like to think, anyway, that civil society in the United States is still sufficiently strong to resist a significant overreach on his part, on the part of, well, not just the Trump administration, but the executive branch in general. So, but then it would also depend on the context. If the Trump administration did something that his supporters, or perhaps even the broader public, really supported or thought necessary, maybe then Congress would not really have the support it needed to crack down and kind of stop that and to kind of ameliorate it. At which point there would be a precedent set and there would be a whole constitutional issue that would have to be dealt with by a later generation. Or perhaps just eat away at the foundations of the political system in the U.S., creating a much bigger problem even later on. But I don't know how likely it is, because again, I don't think the Trump administration is really looking for fights like that. Again, I don't think Trump is like a dictator in the waiting who really just wants to be, el dictator of the United States. I think he might want more power than the executive branch might want. I'm sure there's any number of presidents that have, tried for that. I think what's different about Donald Trump, President Trump, is that, unlike previous presidents, he doesn't seem to have the expertise around him to really facilitate power grabs. It's no stretch to say the executive branch has expanded significantly. Whether or not it's expanded unreasonably is kind of subjective, but there's a good argument to be made that it has over the past 30 years. The Reagan administration, the first Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the second Bush administration, and the Obama administration have all expanded executive power. And in some, over time, it's expanded hugely. And that is kind of a debate that should be had in the United States, the degree to which the executive branch's powers should be pared down and Congress's powers expanded. To be fair, some of that has to do with Congress just not exercising its power. That's a whole other issue and conversation. But I'm getting off on a tangent. Basically, could there be a constitutional crisis? Yes. How could it play out in this political climate? It would depend on the context. If it was just a mistake or something stupid or an overreach, there would probably be sufficient public backlash to force the administration to back down. Maybe even enough, if the public really opposed it, then Congress would probably finally actually do something about it. And Congress is actually the most powerful branch of government in the United States. So if they really want to crack down, they have it well within our power to do so. On the other hand, if a constitutional crisis happens where it's more ambiguous, where maybe there's more public support for the administration or, what have you, in that case, it's a little more dicey. And there could be a significant breakout of partisan discontent as a result, and that could destabilize the political system outright, perhaps even resulting in political violence. That would not be ideal, obviously, but possible. Now, to be fair, I've been couching constitutional crisis in terms of actions by the executive branch. The executive branch is not the only branch that can cause a constitutional crisis. It could also be caused by an act of Congress, or something done by the judicial branch. People have been focusing more on the executive branch lately for, well, obvious reasons, because the Trump administration has even some of the Trump administration supporters are a little cagey on just how clear-cut the Trump administration is on adhering to democratic norms and institutions. Now, that's not a knock against the Trump administration. That's just, there are questions there about the expertise and advice that the president is getting. So let's put it like that. But to be fair to the president and the executive branch generally, Congress and the judicial branch are capable of that. But it's not really clear if there were a constitutional crisis stemming from Congress or the judicial branch, how that would happen at this juncture, because there's no clear avenue there. The judicial branch could do it pretty easily, but they've been pretty well behaved. They've been pretty professional. So it doesn't seem like that would be a vector of a crisis. Congress hypothetically could, but in general, a lot of the stuff they do that's shaky is, most of the legislation that Congress passes that is unconstitutional is passed for superficial theatrical reasons. It's passed more to signal to supporters that they're willing to kind of pursue the interest of political supporters.
Look what I can do.
But when the Supreme Court or whatever court shoots down that legislation, Congress has been very good over the past 5-10 years of kind of backing off and saying, well, we can't do it, oh well. So there doesn't seem like there's any real desire or drive on the part of Congress to overreach there. And again, then that kind of just leaves the executive branch. And, to be fair to Trump, it's not just Trump that's been expanding executive power and creating a lot of these constitutional questions, if not constitutional crises. That's, again, a secular trend over the past few decades. Donald Trump in particular has kind of raised some questions just because of his character and politics, but issues over the executive branch creating a constitutional crisis and disproportionate emphasis and focus on the executive branch is, again, just something that's been in the cards for a while. That's a secular trend. So I hope I kind of addressed that question. I think I kind of covered it. Let's see, question for, what do you think about Trump's tax cuts and then raising military spending? I mean, I don't have a political opinion on it per se. It definitely blew up the budget. That in conjunction with some compromised social spending combined to create a huge spike in the deficit for, I think, the present fiscal year, I think it was. So that, if you're a fiscal hawk, you're not going to like that. The tax cuts themselves, I mean, I think we talked more in depth about the tax cuts when they were passed. I guess that was last year. I don't remember a whole lot about what we talked about at the time, but basically the tax cuts had a stimulative effect. I mean, they did improve the economy somewhat, but tax cuts are always kind of a short-term way to do that. It'll create some increase in the long-term trend in economic growth, but most of the effect is short-term and temporary. So in that sense, it's nice, but meh, I'll take it. If you're interested in economic growth and lower taxes, it's definitely a good thing. But mixing it with a significant increase in spending is questionable. Since if you're decreasing tax revenue but increasing spending, you're not really decreasing taxes. You're actually just deferring taxes to later, because later generations have to pay that, and later generations are going to have to pay for it with taxes. Inflation will lead into some of it, but not all of it. Invariably, you're basically just putting taxes on future generations. So it's not great in terms of a long-term fiscal planning. So I guess I'm just talking about random perspectives about it.
Oh yeah, my grandson's going to be here in a little bit. He's going to cover the bill.
He's got it covered.
That's great.
Yeah, it's, whether they're good, whether the tax cuts in conjunction with the rise in military spending, because there is an argument to be made that the rise in military spending was needed, because military spending had actually been de facto frozen for a number of years because of that whole sequestration boondoggle way back when. For those of you not familiar with sequestration, basically there was a huge debate, many years ago, back when Obama was still president, about the budget. Republicans wanted to, were threatening to shut down the government if Democrats didn't give them some concessions, and so there was a bunch of talk. Nobody could agree on what the budget should look like. And so what happened was some party elders, basically some of the more senior congressmen, got together and they passed some legislation that would allow, that basically was a budget. But it was a very terrible budget. It was a budget that didn't give anybody anything and that had massive cuts to the military and social spending and all manner of things. And the reason they passed that was to incentivize the negotiation of an actual compromise bill. Basically, it was meant to be a threat bill to encourage and ensure that an actual bill was eventually passed. The hilarious thing is that they failed miserably in getting the compromise bill. In fact, they failed completely. So the bullshit bill that was never meant to be the budget bill ended up being the one that passed. And that resulted in big spending cuts and freezes to spending on the military. And because there was never any real compromise after that, there was no new budget passed, and so sequestration, as the bill was called, ended up being the de facto budget, in a number of years subsequent. So the military kind of got hollowed out a little bit. They talk about preparedness and whatnot, but they didn't really have to take the money out of preparedness. The military actually took some of that money out of, could have taken that money out of equipment, procurement, etc. But the military leadership and the executive branch kind of chose to put the blow of the budget cuts mostly on preparedness. That's a whole conversation in of itself. You could kind of talk about the Department of Defense and its own internal bureaucratic politics. But basically, the military got kind of hurt by those budget cuts. And so there was an argument to be made that significantly increasing the military's budget helps kind of make up for that and helps get the military back where it should have been. That said, that doesn't mean it was a good idea to do that and have massive tax cuts in the same year. There's an argument to be made against the fiscal efficacy of that. But again, a lot of this is subjective. I'm not going to say it's good or bad or what you should think about it. People just kind of have to judge that for themselves. I'll describe it, I'll kind of elaborate on some of the mechanisms in place. Long term, there's going to have to tax rise of some kind to pay for it. Short term, you get the benefit of having the military get re-upped and short-term economic benefit. But other than that, whether or not you judge those things to be worthwhile or not is down to individual perspective and preference. I'm not going to tell you what to believe on those counts. Do you think Mexican security crisis will change for the better if the new Mexican government decriminalizes drugs? Probably not. Probably not. And the reason I think not is because most of the violence in Mexico is being driven by cartel activity. And a lot of that cartel activity does not have to do with drug use in Mexico. The biggest consumer of drugs in the world is not Mexico. It's the country to the north of Mexico. That's the big golden market. And if you're a cartel, that's who you want to sell to, and that's where you get most of your revenue. So yeah, there's a lot of violence in Mexico, but a lot of that is fighting over drug routes into the United States. The Colossus of the North, as they like to call it down there. And so legalizing drugs might inhibit drug revenue for cartels in Mexico, but that revenue is not the biggest part of their revenue. Specifically, Mexican drug revenue is not a big part of the Mexican cartel revenue. So I don't think it'll put a big dent in their operations. It might have some useful side effects, that might make drug use a little more normalized, so to speak. It'll decriminalize it. That'll result in fewer people in jail. It might actually make crime prevention a little bit harder, and it might make crime worse. And here's why. It's true that drug laws are often abused. It's true that a lot of people end up in jail who probably should not be in jail, casual drug users and whatnot. But it's also true that having drug laws like that, possession laws, whatnot, gives law enforcement a tool with which to get people they would not otherwise be able to get. So, if you suspect somebody of being engaged in a lot of crime, maybe you can't prove it, but you can maybe get them on an unrelated charge, like, say, drug possession. This is the old Al Capone thing. Al Capone was a big gangster in the United States. He was a big organized crime leader in the United States in the 1930s. But he was smart enough that the law could never really get him. Law enforcement could never arrest him for anything. He was just too clever. But they eventually did get him on tax evasion, because he was laundering all this money and trying to keep it from the IRS. So they know who the guy is, they know he's a kingpin, but they just can't peg him with anything, so they get him with an unrelated charge. So having ambiguous and discretionary drug laws that give a lot of discretionary power to law enforcement, on the one hand, do lend themselves to abuses, but also act as a useful tool for getting people who would otherwise be untouchable. So in that sense, given that there is a big problem in Mexico with drug crime, if not crime in general, removing tools from law enforcement may not be the best thing. Now, on the other hand, you could counter that law enforcement is part of the problem anyway, because it's been so infiltrated by cartels of one sort or another, and there's a lot of corruption in law enforcement anyway. So in that sense, taking that tool away won't make much difference. I mean, probably, from what I understand, and, if you're from Mexico and listening, please do kind of jump in here, because I'm not entirely sure about this, but, if you are caught with drugs, I think it is the case that you can probably just bribe your way out of that. And I'm not entirely sure. Certainly a number of Americans have done that.
Have the money.
But I don't know if that's also true of Mexican citizenry in general. I would be curious to know that, if anybody could kind of answer that. But I just don't think in general that it would put a real dent in the cartels, and I don't think in turn that it would put a big dent in cartel crime. And I think that is kind of the biggest source of violence right now, as far as the crisis in Mexico. Again, I'm not an expert on Mexico in particular, and certainly not of cartels, so I would welcome input by people who are more familiar. I would certainly welcome the input of people from Mexico listening. I would be eager to hear what they had to say, what their perspective of the issue is. Whew, that's questions.
Nice. We're a little bit over time for stream overall, but I'm up for going for another like 15 to 20 if you want to cover some stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I'm always game. I'm looking at our country chart to see who we have tonight.
Nice.
Let's see. Pretty much the usual suspects. Nobody unusual, really.
Well,
Shout out to the...
It doesn't track the individuals at the bottom. It's just the top 10 or top 15, I think.
Yeah, top 15. Shout out to the Brazilians, though. We always have fun with you guys.
Yeah. Brazil has a really strong esports scene in general. There's an example from GSL versus the World, which is basically the Korean circuit versus the everyone else circuit. And there was a Brazilian nominee who was pretty far down in the votes, and there was a Brazilian League of Legends streamer who plugged him and told people to go out and vote for Kelliger, who's Brazilian, and he ended up getting a spot. So it's a pretty friendly and kind of widespread community of esports in Brazil.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I don't know if you followed the final result of GSL, but this is the first time that a non-Korean has won a GSL tier tournament in the history of StarCraft 1 or 2.
Where were they from?
Finland.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Cyril.
Huh.
People joke about region lock. Finland. But he's like the only guy. There are a couple other Finnish pro gamers, but it's not like they have a Korea situation where they have a bunch of people who are super high tier.
Gotcha. Well, before I kind of move on, because there was one thing in particular I wanted to touch on before we quit. A question to the Brazilians listening. You don't have to answer, but I am curious. If you're Brazilian and you're listening, tell me who you think is going to win the election. There's a big presidential election coming up, and from what I remember, De Silva is still running, despite the fact that he's technically in jail. Is he still physically in jail, or not? I don't quite remember, but I think he is running. So technically, and I don't know that he's allowed to, because I think there is a law against it. So I'm a little bit curious if he might win as a write-in candidate or something to that effect. Maybe you Brazilians can kind of clear that up for me, but I am curious what your perspective on the upcoming election is. I think there was another one, too. I don't remember. Anyway, so the thing I wanted to kind of touch on was the big development over the past 3-some weeks, however long it's been since the last time we talked, was Donald Trump talked with Paul Juncker? I think that's what his name is. Juncker is his last name anyway. He's basically the head of the European Union Commission. And they had a big negotiation about the trade war, such as it was, between the European Union and the United States. And that specifically regarded the steel and aluminum tariffs that the United States had imposed, as well as the automotive tariffs that the United States government was threatening. And it was looking like that the trade war there would escalate further. But then the two talked and they came to a kind of agreement. And it looks like the trade war is effectively over. Well, maybe frozen would be more accurate. That was kind of the crux of the deal. But that was a major shift in U.S. trade policy, basically. You know, it had looked like the U.S. government was going to keep pushing the Europeans as well as just everybody else at the same time. But it looks like they reached a kind of concordant, and that the emphasis is going to be put more on China specifically rather than just trade wars with anybody and everybody. So at least in the case of the European Union, that's on the rocks. That's been put on ice. I'm trying to find the notes I had for it.
You get a trade war, and you get a trade war.
Well, I can't quite find it. But basically, the crux of the agreement that was made, the compromise that was made, was that you know, there would be no tariffs. Well, what was agreed is that they would work towards having no tariffs between each other, between the European Union and the United States. And that they would work towards free trade in, let me see if I can remember this, free trade in non-automotive goods. Non-automotive industrial goods. That's what the crux of it was, which is kind of a cop-out because most of the industrial trade between, a lot of the industrial trade between the US and the EU is automotive. So that doesn't leave a whole lot. But nominally, there's part of the agreement to freezing, and that was the biggest thing coming out of the agreement. There will be no tariff increases while the new trade agreement is negotiated. And given that trade negotiations take like years, that basically means it's over. There's no, it's basically frozen. But as part of the trade agreement that they're going to negotiate no tariffs and then non-automotive industrial goods. Now here's the thing about this. This is a little bit bullshit, because this is exactly what was already agreed to in the trade treaty, the trade agreement that had been negotiated between the US and the EU. I don't remember what the name of it was, but basically it was scrapped more or less as soon as the Trump administration started its term. And so there had already been an agreement in place where there would have been no, basically no tariffs and free trade in non-automotive industrial goods. But it got scrapped. So this is kind of back to the past, basically. This is basically the agreement that was being negotiated before. Now, there are two new things that were in the Trump-Juncker negotiation that were not in the previous agreement, which is that the EU agreed to buy more U.S. soy specifically, and also agreed to import more light natural gas. Now, this is a little bit bullshit as well. And here's why. For one, U.S. soy is getting cheaper because of the retaliatory tariffs imposed by China. And the European Union economy is improving in general. So it's no shock that the European Union is going to buy soy. That's the natural market occurrence. The European Union isn't going to have to do anything to do that. So basically the EU agreed to do something it was going to do anyway. Or more accurately, the EU market actors were going to do anyway. The agreement to import more light natural gas, also a little bit bullshit, because they were probably going to import more anyway because there are more light natural gas terminals coming online in the United States and there's going to be more supply. I don't think it's ever going to be a whole lot, though. There seems to be some talk that the United States can kind of wean the European Union off of gas imports from Russia and the Middle East by getting them to buy light natural gas from the US. But it's probably never going to happen because the capacity is not nearly as great. You know, the amount of gas being imported into Europe from the Middle East and Russia is way higher than the capacity of the US to export light natural gas. So even if the Europeans bought all of the natural gas that they could get, just max out that capacity, it still wouldn't be enough to fit their demand. But they wouldn't even do that because light natural gas is very expensive to import from the United States. It's not really cost competitive to load it up onto ships and sail it across the ocean and then unload it, etc. It's a complicated process. It's only very niche markets where it's really cost competitive. And the European Union is not one of those niche markets. So that's never really going to happen. This idea of the United States as being the principal gas supplier to Europe is almost certainly never going to happen. They could buy more, but again, if they do buy more, it's going to be market forces. So my impression then of the overall Trump-Juncker negotiation is that a lot of it is just for show. A lot of the agreement that was made is basically just, okay, we're going to freeze the trade war, but we don't want to do it in a way that it looks like we're not getting something out of it. So let's have a little horse and pony show at the end of it where we just kind of agree to work towards something that we already were working towards. Pretty good political showmanship, but not a lot of substantive policy making. But it is significant development because it means that there's not going to be that threat looming over the trade relationship between Europe and the United States. Businesses can kind of go on with confidence that the relationship is not threatened. And also it means that the United States can do what it probably should have done from the start, which is to coordinate trade policy vis-a-vis China. The European Union and the United States working together to try to compel China to offer trade concessions and to kind of behave better, broadly speaking, is going to be a lot more effective than the United States working by itself. So now that that sort of side show, that sort of a distraction of the EU-US trade dispute is kind of off the shelf, off the table, there can be more productive policy negotiation vis-a-vis China. So that was probably the most significant news development, I think, over the past 3 weeks. The most significant change in the sort of diplomatic calculus in the world. What was I thinking of earlier? I was thinking of something earlier and it totally slipped my mind and now it's bugging me.
Shit.
Oh hell, I don't know. Oh, we've got some Bulgarians. 2 Bulgarians. Neat. Hasn't been in the news in a while. Romania's been getting all the attention because of all their anti-corruption protests. That probably won't go anywhere. Gosh, who's Prime Minister of Bulgaria right now? I think it's still that same guy who keeps getting... People keep trying to impeach him, and then it doesn't work. Kind of has a political staying power. I think he's socialist? Not entirely. Socialist Party, something to that effect. Yeah, Bulgaria is very good at staying out of the news, which is a good thing. Countries that end up in the news generally are not in the news for good reasons. So, more power to Bulgaria. Oh, there was something I wanted to mention earlier. A president, specifically I'm going to talk here about impeachment rules in the United States. There's been a lot of talk about the Mueller investigation, trying to find something to impeach Trump for. That's actually not how impeachment works. Impeachment is not the punishment for a president committing a crime. Impeachment is a tool that Congress uses when it judges that a president should not be in office, basically. It's more subjective than basically just crime. Technically, the president does not have to have committed a crime to be impeached. That's the principal takeaway. Hypothetically, Congress could totally just impeach Donald Trump, like right now. And they wouldn't have to actually find him really guilty of anything. Technically, there is a trial. There is supposed to be an investigation that determines whether or not a given president under investigation has committed some kind of wrongdoing, whether he's guilty of doing something that he is accused of doing. But you don't technically have to find him guilty to impeach him. And mind you, you don't even have to investigate him for something substantive. Like if you really wanted to impeach a president, you could launch an investigation to see whether or not he had ever jaywalked in his life. Ooh. And if you found him guilty, you could impeach him. You could just say, oh, well, that's behavior unbecoming of the president in the opinion of this Congress. So we're going to impeach you. And so long as you have the votes, you can do that. So it's a more subjective process than it's kind of made out to be in the media. You don't really have to find him guilty of anything to impeach him. You can just kind of find him generally unbecoming of the office and impeach him for that. Generally, it's not used that way because generally it generates a lot of partisan tension. a president would have to be humongously unpopular, not only amongst his political rivals, but also amongst his supporters, to really generate enough support in Congress for a full impeachment. It's very rarely happened in the U.S. In fact, I don't think any president has ever actually been impeached.
Wasn't Clinton impeached?
Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives, but in order to actually be fully impeached and removed from office, you also have to have the Senate vote to impeach you, and the Senate did not vote to impeach him. So he was never fully removed. I think Andrew Jackson was similarly almost impeached, but never actually was.
He was just kind of impeached.
I think. If I'm wrong on that, somebody in chat can correct me, but I don't think Andrew Jackson was ever actually removed from office. And Nixon was, Nixon quit basically before they could do it.
You can't fire me, I quit. You can't break up with me, I'm breaking up with you. Wow.
Yeah, so if I'm wrong on that, somebody can correct me, but roughly, I believe that is the case. Let's see, what else? If we have time, we could talk about Italy.
I'm stuck in a game, go ahead. This guy won't die.
So Italy, maybe we have some. Do we have any Italians in chat? It doesn't look like we do in the feed. Well, if there are, please chime in here. But Italy passed what the government there is calling its dignity decree. And it's a bit of economic legislation that's meant to make employment more secure. You know, Italy, like a lot of countries in the West, has seen a huge explosion in, what would you call it, temporary work, basically, temp work. It has different names. Some people call it the gig economy, gig jobs, whatever you want to call it, but basically temp work. And as there have been more temp workers, there's been a lot more insecurity in employment, because you never know if you're going to get removed, whether or not you'll have a job in the next 6 months to a year, etc. So the Italian government passed some legislation that did a couple of things. For one, it prevents companies from renewing a temp contract more than 4 times. It had been 5, the limit had been 5, now it's 4. And the idea there is that, all right, if you want to keep this guy after 4 renewals, you have to just hire him as a formal employee. You can't just keep rehiring him as a temp worker. There's also a limit on the length of contracts. So they've been reduced, the length of a temp contract has been reduced from 36 to 24 months. So not only can you not renew the contract as many times, the contracts themselves do not last as long. Also, if you're going to renew a if you're going to renew a contract beyond 12 months, you have to have a reason to do it. And I don't think I remember reading that it had to be a particularly substantive reason, but basically if you do it without a reason, then the government can kind of jump in and forcibly change the contract from a temp contract to a formal employment contract. So all of this, you know, the gist of all of this is that it's meant to encourage firms to hire more formal workers, to transition temp workers into formal work. And the trouble is, it's probably going to have the opposite effect. You know, the more it's going to make firms rather more hesitant to hire in the first place, because basically the de facto cost of hiring is higher. You know, there's more risk to taking on somebody because you don't know if you're going to be able to keep them on for as long. This is exacerbated by an additional part of the legislation, or perhaps some separate legislation, I don't quite remember which. But basically another new rule is that severance pay it has been raised for those on permanent contracts. So if you actually do become a fully employed worker, your severance pay that you get when you're fired or let go has been increased. So just in total, there's not as much, there's more risk for the employer to hire somebody. You know, you can't keep the temp workers that you have for as long. And if you do decide to transition them to full employment, there's more risk that you'll end up having to fire them sometime later and be stuck with the severance pay for an extended period of time. Mind you, severance pay in Europe can be quite high. If you're a firm and you want to let somebody go because they're underperforming or because you need to cut costs, it really hurts you to be stuck paying their salary even after they stop working for you for a number of months. That's basically just deadweight cost to you. So on the one hand, yes, it is better to have more employment security for workers, and the temp worker issue and the temp worker economy, such as it is not a great working environment. But on the other hand, the whole reason the temp worker economy emerged in the first place is because it's difficult. Well, in Europe's case, it's because it's difficult to hire workers. They're relatively expensive. And none of these rule changes are doing anything to really change that. More to the point, there's also the issue of productivity. Productivity in Europe has been dragging, and so there's just not as much incentive to hire a lot of workers. So making them more expensive just exacerbates that and makes hiring less attractive. The U.S. has a similar dynamic in play, but it doesn't manifest in the same way. In Europe, it's an over-reliance on temp workers. In the United States, it's resulting more in deregulation. We have a lot of temp workers here too, but the gig economy kind of plays out a little differently. We don't have the same regulatory apparatus that Europe does. Europe, for example, has much higher structural unemployment because of that regulatory apparatus. They get a lot more benefits when they're unemployed, but there's a lot more unemployed because it's harder to hire and more expensive to hire, and there's more risk to hiring. In the United States, we have much less unemployment, but we also have a lot more temp workers who are a lot more poorly paid and fewer benefits. So it's kind of a trade-off. I won't say which is better or worse because that's subjective. People can draw their own conclusions on that, but fundamentally, the forces driving those changes are the same in both Europe and the U.S. That's kind of the overarching point there. And Italy is subject to that. And just kind of the point I want to make here is that making employing people more risky for the employer doesn't really deal with that fundamental driver of the problem. It actually kind of makes it worse in some ways. But until that fundamental problem is kind of dealt with, the temp economy isn't going anywhere, and employment in Europe and Italy in particular will probably not improve substantively.
Sweet. Well, we are 9 hours and 5 into the stream. Cool. I'm feeling like we'll call it here.
Thanks for going long with me.
Yeah, no problem. I feel like we could serve to catch up a little bit. I enjoy these Sunday sessions when I miss them. I don't always say it to you, but it makes me sad. So I'm glad we're up and rolling. I'll be trying to be more consistent and stable for the next couple weeks. I don't really have anything big until November. I had a bunch of stuff over the course of the summer with the move, and then there were the trip up to Pact's brother's birthday and all kinds of fun stuff, but we're in it to build the stream. The revenue's been up. There's a new element added to Twitch that I've been doing. I did one today. It's called the Bounty Board, and game developers can pay Twitch, and then Twitch will basically put on a bulletin board for the broadcasters. If you stream this game for this long, you get this many dollars for this many viewers.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that's opened up a new revenue stream. It's been a mixed bag from the games that I've played. Some of them are really funny, and it's a good game, and I enjoy it and stuff, and some of them are really bad, and it's kind of like, when is this going to be over?
Yeah.
The game that we played today is in beta, and they don't actually have all of the game done, and there wasn't an hour worth of content in the game.
Oh, yeah.
So that was kind of sticky. But
well, I guess, what's the old saying in PR? Any exposure is good exposure?
Yeah. To an extent, yeah. I mean, the game that's a recent example is Dead Man's Sky, where it was so bad from the hype that it got that people knew about the name of it, and I think now people play it some. So it's one of those, if you can't be famous, be infamous.
Yeah.
The worst for a game is if you're like just slightly bad, so that no one really talks about it. If you're extremely bad, then some people are like, ooh, I want to see it. I want to see this badness unfold.
Yeah, you want to see the wreck on the racetrack.
Yeah.
Understand? Yeah, the ambiguity is a really hurtful factor there. There's just no, what would you call it, exposure, like you say.
Yeah, the pay is good though, because the range is between 280 USD to 180 for an hour, which is like, holy shit, really? But it is.
That's really good.
Yeah. So we take it as it goes. Trying to move up from that lower class to middle class wage feels good.
Moving on up, living the dream.
Yep. Well, cool. Good having you on, dude. This is episode 33 of Agent Smith, the person who is a living podcast. Is this guy a podcast? No, it's a real person.
I do technically have one.
You gotta let me know when your next one is done. I'll plug the shit out of it.
Someday. I'm having to dig through all of these really stale diplomatic cables, and it's hard to really get excited about it, especially since 90% of it is stuff I can't use.
Well, if I can give you some advice real quick.
Please do.
The 10 minutes of the USSR collapsing, I think you could really make a lot of content pretty fast with that. That's not going to be the super accurate, but if you want to put stuff out there and kind of build a body, I think it should be kind of based on what you know right now. And then you could have like the hardcore podcast, which is like an hour and a half expose of some complicated topic where you do your research and it's a big project. But doing the small stuff, most of us, like me, I don't know shit about this. So if you just talk for 10 minutes, that's more than I know. And it gives me at least a vague sense of what happened. As opposed to the bleeding edge. My audience doesn't know about that. Maybe I have a couple people who are like holding you accountable and be like, no, not this.
Yeah, it's good advice, and you're actually the second person now who suggested I do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's definitely. I think that's definitely going to be the model I go with. I just want to kind of get this project out the door since it's almost done. I just need to get this stinger out of the way, and then I can start recording, and then I'll have it out the door.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to start focusing on more volume.
Yeah.
Get that body out there, like you mentioned.
We could probably brainstorm a list maybe in the next session of just some general topics that come up a lot, so that if someone asks, hey, what's your opinion on cryptocurrency, you could just link a video. Because that's the adaptation that I've developed as a streamer, where they ask me a million times, hey, Neuro, I'm getting back into StarCraft. What's a build order? I don't want to have to explain that every time.
Yeah. Yeah, just have something that you can whip out.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Yeah, and once you get that, then you have to get a Patreon so you can get money. And then you're good to go.
Yeah, get money. That's a good idea. I like the sound of that.
Yeah. The vast treasure troves of the internet will just spill golden coins into your account.
Ideally. We'll get there. I got to build up first. That's the principal thing, though. Like you say, you got to get out there and have some body of work, a portfolio, if you will.
Someone just donated a $5 for you. You see that? Oh. Golden coins. That's
you.
How easy it is.
Yeah, I was thinking not only of, besides the podcast, I was also thinking of trying something like a weekly column, just to something, to write out, think of ideas, kind of express them, just to have that be some secondary content out there. So any ideas on that count would be appreciated, not only from Neuro, but also from Chad. If anybody has anything they'd like to read about, not in any great depth per se, but anything in particular, let me know, and I'll put it on my list of topics.
Well, we have your Twitter in the command. I would guess that if someone tweeted at you, can you talk about this topic, that would be a good way of allowing you to build a list of content that you could do.
Yeah, that would be fine. Yeah, I don't have any problem.
Smith.
Yeah, or email me. I think my email is wandering somewhere out there.
Your real name is not John Smith. We had some problems with this in today's chat. They were like, how do people find this guy? Exactly.
Anonymity. The sweet embrace of internet and
I was talking
more valuable.
I was talking with Pact about that yesterday, about the struggle of being noticed in the world, and how as a Twitch streamer you're kind of on the other end, where for the dollars that you earn you get like overly noticed. And it's like, not being noticed is nice sometimes. And then a lot of people, they're on the other side of the spectrum where it's like they need someone to acknowledge them in some capacity. And if you've been acknowledged to a point, it's like, please stop acknowledging me, leave me alone for a minute.
Yeah, it's, lots of celebrities have that problem. They kind of miss their old life. It's hard to know who to trust when, everybody knows you, and kind of, well, it's especially problematic when people think they know you, because then they get a little overly familiar.
Yeah.
And then they're all up in your face.
Yeah, someone in the chat is saying that they recognize your voice and they're asking what podcasts you've been on.
I'm not the war nerd. That might be what he's thinking of. I sound a little bit similar, and we kind of talk about similar topics, but different people. Yeah. Interesting podcast, by the way. Go check him out if you haven't already. War Nerd by Gary Brecher. You won't agree with everything he talks about or asserts, but the topics are definitely interesting. So a little plug for somebody else.
Yeah, no, I think it's better to do that than to be bitter and resentful of other people who are successful. Which some people do. God damn that guy, he has follows on his YouTube. Damn him!
No, I reserve my loathing for myself. I'm very self-loathing, so I monopolize all that.
Well, we love you enough to make up for it, so it's fine.
Oh, thank you.
Well, cool. So we should be good to go for next Sunday as well. I know it was like an hour late today because I need to have a high enough viewership to do the bounty thing, so I did that, and then we did it after, so thank you for being patient.
No, I'm very flexible. Whatever you need to do. I had a smoothie. It was nice.
Sweet. So if anyone missed the beginning or the middle of this, it will be on YouTube. I could probably do it tomorrow or something. But yep, thanks for coming on, Agent Smith.
Yep,
we'll see you on the next time.
Yep, see you next time.